an associate professor at our departments of economics, IIUM. He has taught a variety of courses, including the graduate level of industrial organization and business economics for MBA program at IIUM. He has been a regular guest instructor for the Asia Business Leader, ABL project at the Graduate School of Management, Kyoto University since 2014. Dr. Noorihsan specialized in industrial economics, and his research interest covers a wide range of applied areas and sectoral studies, including productivity and efficiency, tourism industry and telecommunication sector. His consultancy project have focused on impact study for urban planning, frontier firms analysis, and public policy initiative, right? Dr. Noorihsan has consulted for companies and public sector institutions, including the Ministry of Health, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Malaysia Productivity Corporation, Plan Malaysia, and the Ministry.
Salam, Zera. I think you mistakenly muted your mic. Yep.
Okay. So continue on that. Okay, in 2006, he was awarded the prestigious Endeavour Award by the Australian government. So what an experienced speaker, inshallah, we're gonna have this morning. With that, I have the honor to invite our honorable speaker. Let me pass the floor to Associate Professor Dr. Noorihsan Mohamad.
Thank you, Dr. Zera. Assalamualaikum, everyone. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. First of all, let me thank the organizer for giving me the opportunity to share some insights with all the participants. I would also like to thank all the participants who have been, consistently joining, our Sunday session. And as mentioned by Dr. Zera earlier, this is actually week number 8. And in my usual class, normally when we reach week number 8, we're going to have a quiz, right? So for me to start the session, I think what I'm going to do is that I'll just give you a quick recap of what you have covered so far. I think this is very important because what I'm going to cover today, to some extent relevant to whatever that had been covered previously by different instructors. So it could also at the same time refresh some of your memories with regards to what you have learned over the past 8 weeks. So very quickly, when we talk about Islamic economics, in the first 2 weeks, the speakers basically talk about the foundation of Islamic economics, which basically refers to the Islamic worldview. And without really understanding the Islamic worldview, then you will not get the proper sense of what is Islamic economics is all about. And in any discussion, throughout the past few weeks, there always be whereby the instructors will bring you back to the worldview that had been discussed in the first 2 weeks. And then in week number 3, the instructor also described, something which is slightly different from the conventional economics, whereby the role of the third sector, which is, pretty pertinent, in the context is Islamic economics, because we have all those institutions of wakaf, sadaqah, zakat, would essentially play a very important role, in affecting, and providing outcome in the context of an economy. And of course, when we talk about, the Islamic worldview in week number 4, we also discuss about the maqasid to understand really the context of how the Turah, could be applicable in explaining about the contemporary issues. And that has to be looked from the perspective of, the aim of Sharia. And then in week number 5, Dr. Nizam specifically briefed you guys about intro to macroeconomics. What I'm going to talk today is something related to macroeconomics, and we're going to go in detail a little bit more, especially looking at the stabilization policies and some of the economic issues that we have to understand, throughout the economic scenario. And I think last week or so, the instructor, Prof. Norma, also described and explained to you guys about monetary policy. And in the context of money policy, this basically play an important role together with, the policy, what I'm going to explain today, especially in the context of fiscal policy. So I'm referring to week 8, and we are basically, at this juncture. And overall, what I can say in terms of the main idea that I'm going to describe to you guys would be looking at, the causes of economic fluctuations. What would be the implications or the impacts of economic fluctuations? And specifically, we're going to try to brief a little bit in the context of problems of unemployment and also problems of inflation. And having, these two problems that we have to deal over and over throughout different decades of our economic scenario, there were and there are various initiatives on the part of the government to basically, to address, these problems of inflation and also problems of recession. And I think this is very important, and it's really timely because, the past few years we were hit by the pandemic, and almost, everywhere the economic slowdown were hurting all different economies. And then in the process of recovery, nowadays we can see that we started to also see inflation coming in. And, those two issues will then going to be described, later in my lecture. So these are the way how I'm going to outline my lecture for today. So essentially, I'll be talking about, two issues. One is to concentrate on the main economic issues that could persist in the economy, especially in the context of unemployment and also inflation. But of course, in order to understand the problem, we have to understand in terms of the causes. And how do we explain in the context in economy, whereby economic activity fluctuates over time over the past few years due to several different scenarios and also factors. So the first around 30 or 40 minutes, I'm going to spend more on describing about macroeconomic instability. And then right after that, I'm going to talk about the policy on the part of the government, how they can basically address the issues specifically in the context of unemployment and inflation. What are the measures that are available in the context of an economics point of view in order to promote and also to stimulate back the economy? So these two things are interrelated, okay? And I think I'll just continue right after I finish the first session. I'll just move on and then try to describe, the role of government. And then I'll also try to bring in some context of Islamic perspective so that it can bring added value, to you guys. Now, before I move further, I think it's also very important because we are discussing about macroeconomics. And because when Dr. Nizam in week 5 described about micro and also the difference with macroeconomics, it was like few weeks back. So let me just quickly recall some of those important things so that you can get a better context of what I'll be talking about at the later stage. So when we talk about macroeconomics, some of the questions that normally we're going to ask would be what being listed there on the screen. What's, the growth of rate of the economy? We always listen to the news, where the news reports about the economic growth rates, whether the economy started to recover. But the questions that relates to, how rapid is the economic growth, those is actually one of an example of questions under macroeconomics. And similarly, the questions with regards to recession, whether recession has ended, what are the policy measures on the part of the government, to handle the issue of recession. Those are also what we consider as macroeconomics. Similarly, in the context of price level, when you are looking at the aggregated level, what really happened to the economy in the context of price, whether there have been an increase in price over the past few years, that is also a question of macroeconomics because we are looking at the overall aspect of the economy and how this inflation or price level could basically affect different economic agents in the economy. Other than that, of course, questions that relates to exchange rate, how exchange rate affects the export and also import, and the implications of having huge government deficit, for instance. What would happen, when the government started to borrow more, as a way how to promote economic recovery, especially in the context of the recent pandemic. Most governments throughout, worldwide, they embark on expansionary fiscal policy, whereby in order to increase the spending to stimulate the economy, some of those governments opted to basically borrow, and this basically also gonna bring some implications. So those are some of the questions that relates to macroeconomics. And by looking at those questions, I hope you could get some rough idea, whereby when we talk about macroeconomics, it is actually a study that looks at the entire economy as a whole. So it's different from microeconomics because microeconomics, you are trying to study the behavior of individual economic agents. If you are looking from the perspective of firms, meaning that you try to look at how firms, could allocate their resources in order to maximize profit. That is a specific questions that relates to production on the part of producers. So that is microeconomics. But when we start to consider the interactions of all different economic agents, the consumers, the producers, when they interact and how it basically going to affect the entire economy overall, that is basically what we call as macroeconomics. So in other words, macroeconomics deals a lot with policy issues. On the part of the government, they have to basically ensure that the economy gonna grow, according to the set of objectives that they have. and they want to make sure that in any way, the level of unemployment would be low to ensure that it won't affect the survival of the people in terms of the incomes. And they also want to make sure that, the issue of distributions of income or wealth could also be, addressed, for instance. So when you talk about macroeconomics, there is always a connection with regards to policy, because when you understand macroeconomics, you try to basically understand the causes of economic instability, and it won't stop there, meaning that, on the part of the government, we want to understand how the policy makers would come out with appropriate policy in order to address any economic instability, either the problem of recession or inflation. So quickly, I'll just gonna explain to you guys in terms of the objective, of Islamic macroeconomics. So in short, I can just put it up, based on these three themes. Number one is, to ensure that whatever policy that being presented, it should basically promotes economic growth. The importance of economic growth is because, when you have new production, when there is new outputs in the economy, that basically gonna generate greater employment opportunities. And similarly, that will trickle down, whereby it also gonna increase, the income for the economy. And when we talk about income for the economy, we are not only talking about income of the household, we are also talking about the income of the producers as well as the income of the government. Because when you have economic growth, businesses are making profits, there is demand, people are buying the products, and people secure jobs, they will bring back, their salary, and then they could spend. And at the same time, government would also be able to capture much larger revenue from the income tax as well as from the business tax or corporate tax. Secondly is in terms of economic equity. So economic equity here concerns about the distributional issues. So the problem or the main focus is not just on achieving higher economic growth, but there is another dimension which is also very important, whereby the government or the policy maker will have to make sure that, they can share the prosperity, among the people. So this is in accordance to Islamic junctions, whereby, it is part of a way to promote justice, okay, to make sure that, those people who are in need, they will get the necessary assistance to make sure that they can live, throughout their life. And the third theme, when we talk about objective of Islamic macroeconomics, is basically on economic stability. And I think my lecture today, especially when we talk about policy initiative on the part of the policymaker, will try to concentrate more on the aspect where the solutions or the government intervention would be to provide economic stability, or in other words, to sustain economic growth. And I believe that in other sessions, later on, you will be venturing into another topic as well, such as economic development from Islamic perspective, distributional aspect of in the Islamic economics. Those first two themes will be discussed further, in those sessions, inshallah. So when we talk about economic stability, again, we do not want to have too much of volatility in the economy, because when you have too much of volatility, that basically gonna brings much more uncertainty, and this uncertainty could basically affect confidence levels of the investors, and then it can also turn down, the level of confidence among the consumers, whereby they might not want to spend. Spending in the economy is very important because, by having the spending in the economy, is that basically going to provide signals to the producers to keep producing more. So we'll come back to that, especially when we talk about spending at the aggregated level. But again, when we talk about the objective of macroeconomics, if you go and look at the conventional textbook, some of the things that they highlighted would be similar to what I have mentioned to you here. Okay, but there are certain important aspects that basically make Islamic economics more unique, in the sense that, when we describe about the concept of growth or the concept of development and progress, we have the worldview, okay, the Islamic worldview. And this Islamic worldview and also the Maqasid Sharia basically going to be our guiding principle. So in other words, we are not only looking from the context of material well-being, but it is also important on the part of Islamic economics to ensure that the development and progress of the economy will come together with, spiritual well-being and also intellectual well-being, which is consistent with the Maqasid al-Sharia. Secondly, I also highlight here that, in the context of Islamic economy, there have been huge emphasis really on the importance of the third sector. And this has been manifested clearly, through different institutions that we have or different instruments that we have, such as, zakah, sadaqah, waqaf. All these are the instruments that may relate, to the third sector economy. And this somehow creates uniqueness in the context of Islamic economics, because the role of the third sector seems to be very big and very important, to complement whatever policy measures on the part of the government. The third aspect would be in the context of the financial and also the monetary system, what you had covered in the previous week, whereby we have proper rules, we have specific guidelines in terms of how, to do trade and transactions and how to conduct the monetary systems and also the financial systems. And it has been made clear that, it should be interest-free, riba-free. And if we sum up all these different nature and different criteria of what we have in the context of Islamic macroeconomics objective, you can see that, all these put together is actually in harmony with the Maqasid al-Sharia, which is basically to promote public interests. And similarly, this is also, in the sense that when we talk about Islamic worldview, we mentioned about the attainment of falah, not only, in this life, but also in the hereafter. And there is also an element of adil there, justice, to make sure that nobody, in the system will be discriminated. So that is why, certain rules will have to be made clear by the government, to promote ma'ruf, okay, and also to eliminate munkar. So let me just try to give you an overall context first, the way how we're gonna narrate this session, session 1 and also session 2 together. But when we talk about macroeconomics, like what I said to you earlier, it deals a lot with policy, okay, on the part of the government, the policy maker. And when we talk about policy, and if we try to focus on stabilization policy, among the policies that are available in the context of economics is what we call as fiscal policy and also monetary policy. I think this part had been discussed in the earlier session. This is basically what I'm going to share with you guys more later on, whereby fiscal policy can be further broken down into two types, whether it is expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy. But for the policy makers to come out with proper policy measures, they need to basically know something in advance. You cannot come out with policy without really understanding the problem. I give you an example. If you go to the doctor, before the doctor gives you prescription, medication, certainly the doctor will have to do some diagnosis. The doctor will have to do some checkup, okay, to make sure to understand really what is the health problem. Whether you have a fever, then probably the doctor will give you paracetamol. If you have a high blood pressure, probably the doctor will give different medicine which suits for that particular problem, for instance. So same goes here. For a policymaker, the policy initiative will not just come out of nowhere. They first have to basically understand the problem. Okay, so that is why that has to come before the policy initiatives. So I put there number 2, policymakers will have to identify the issues and problems. And specifically here, we are talking about two major economic issues. One is the unemployment, or this is actually a result of recession. And then secondly, the problems of inflation. Because different problems, whether it is problems of unemployment or recession or inflation, you will have different policy prescriptions. Okay, and how do you really understand the problems there? That is very important. Okay, if you could not really understand the nature of the problem and you could not identify whether it's due to cost push inflation or demand pull inflation, then your policy might not be effective, because it depends really in terms of the understanding of what is the causes or the problems that really happen in the economy. And for policymakers to get a good idea in terms of the problems and to see what are the causes of these problems, that is why we have to basically go back, to economic indicators. Okay, so economic indicators basically gonna provide some signal to the policymaker, what kind of problems that we are expecting, and that is where the policymakers will be able to identify the problem and also come up with a specific policy initiatives. And when we talk about economic indicators, in many countries, especially in less developed countries, for instance, one of the challenges that they are facing would be in terms of having a proper data set, having a proper system, to compile and then to analyze the data. So that makes it more difficult for them to really identify the problem, for them to really understand the nature of the problem in order for them to come up with proper policy initiatives. So when we talk about economic indicators, this is where in the previous session, I think in week 5, the instructor described briefly about the concept of gross domestic product And then in order for us to understand, the health of the economy, we're also going to look at some of the important indicators, like what I have indicated here, the unemployment rate, the consumer price index, the exchange rate, export and import data, and especially, in the context of for policymakers to have some predictable understanding in terms of what could happen to the economy, in the next couple of months or in the next couple of quarters. Normally, they're also going to look at the leading indicators. When it comes to leading indicators, different countries, basically, they have different sets of, items that they considered as an index, for them to come up with the index. In Malaysia, we have the leading indicator. In US, they call it leading index, but the component in deriving the index is slightly different from one another, depending on the nature of the economic structure and so on. So all these three stages comes hand in hand. So if I want to go back to my example earlier, when someone goes and visit a doctor, before the doctor gives the prescription or the medication, the doctor will have to basically identify the problems to diagnose the patient. And how the doctor, gonna check. This is where the doctor gonna check the temperature. So you can consider that temperature is one of the indicator, how good is your health. And the doctor also going to check your heartbeat, for instance, your sugar level, and so many other things. Okay, all those are basically describing about the indicators. And because these indicators, to some extent, it's going to explain to us what are the problems that you are facing in order for the policymakers to come up with a proper and appropriate policies to address the issues. So when we talk about economic indicators, gross domestic product, one thing that we have to really understand in the context of an economy, our economic activity fluctuates over time. And normally, in order for us to understand the volatility of our economy, will refer to the output level or the GDP of an economy. And what I'm sharing with you here on the screen, this is actually describing about GDP growth rates for the case of Malaysia. So I'll just pick up an example for the case of Malaysia so that at least you guys can also get some sense in terms of what really happening, in the context of Malaysia. So this data basically taken from IMF data, and it basically described the growth of output for the Malaysian economy over the past few decades, from 1980s up until the more recent years. And if I take up, one point here, okay, probably this is around 7%. So what it basically described here is that Malaysian economy, somewhere in the period of 1984, it basically able to increase their production, as compared to the year before by around 7%. So when we are talking about growth rates, we are basically comparing, in this context, annual with the previous year, and to show how we perform, over the past couple of years. So you can see that there is ups and downs in the economic activity and also in output level for Malaysia. And take note that, right in the middle here, this is basically corresponding to 0%. And anything below 0%, that basically corresponds to the negative growth. So when you talk about negative growth, this basically describes when your output level is declining as compared to what you produced a year before. So economists try to understand these fluctuations because these fluctuations in economic activity explain a lot in terms of what you could expect in terms of the problem that the economy could face. And specifically, economists try to basically divide, the business cycle, the ups and downs of the economic activity based on 4 different phases. One is what they call peak, and then the second phase is what they call as contraction or recession. And then the third one is basically what we call as trough. This is basically the lowest level of recession, before you reach the recovery period. So the fourth phase is basically expansion, or what we call as recovery phase. And if you look at the Malaysian data, you can see really in terms of, you can break it down into several cycles. For instance, I can describe that this is one cycle whereby you have peak, okay, and then there is a decline in output level. And then this is basically what we consider as the recession phase. And in the context of an economy, normally we will consider a period of recession if there is a 6 consecutive months of declining in output level, okay, or 2 quarters. And this is trough. And then this is basically expansion or recovery period. So this is one cycle. And then you can also see another cycle is happening during the period of the late 1990s. This is especially what we call as the Asian financial crisis. So there was a huge dip in terms of output level. So this is about -7% reduction in output as compared to the previous year. If you look at the period of 1990s, this is where Malaysian were considered to be the one of the Asian tigers, because Malaysia recorded high level of economic growth. On average, if you look at the worldwide growth rates overall, countries basically recorded average around 2 to 3%. So if you could grow at a rate above 6 or 7% on an annual basis, that basically shows significant improvement in terms of output from time to time. And then you also have another cycle here, another business cycle here. This is basically the peak, and then you have the recession, and then this is basically trough, and then this is recovery period or expansion. And this specifically is referring to the global financial crisis. And then the more recent one, because of the pandemic, you could also see the impact in terms of the output level to the economy. So this is the recession period phase. Okay, this is basically the trough, and then slowly the economy started to recover. Okay, so even if you look at the economic reports, I have one example here. This is basically from the Malaysian economic report. Policymakers, they try to really understand this business cycle because it described in terms of the experience that they had in terms of the policy measures that they had taken over the last few decades, in addressing the issue of recession, for instance. But one thing that you have to understand, different recessions or different business cycle might have different causes that it originates from. Okay, 1997, 1998, it was Asian financial crisis. The issue originating from, foreign exchange rate. In the context of 2008, 2009, that is global financial crisis that originates from the United States. And because we are in the globalized world, we do export and export. To some extent, Malaysia also affected because, US is the second largest trading partners. We export a lot of our products to the United States. So when they are in recession, so they cut down their imports. So we also affected because we export less. So it affects our local production because less of demand in terms of our products from abroad. And when we try to understand in terms of the implications, when you have these ups and downs in the economy, it relates to two main problems. Number one is the problems of unemployment. And of course, normally when we talk about problems of unemployment, we are basically referring to the phase of recession. You know, when your economy started to having economic slowdown, companies started to basically cut down their production, and then eventually they started to lay off workers, and then people become unemployed. Okay, and you can see different degree or level of intensity how recession affects the unemployment rate. For the case of Malaysia, the crisis in the mid-1980s gave huge impact on unemployment rate. But if you compare with the period of the Asian financial crisis, you know, sometime in 1997, 1998, the impact was not as large as what happened in the period of 1980s because of, you know, different reasons and different causes altogether. And then if you look at the period of 2008-2009, there was also a slight peak, you know, in the context of unemployment rate, as well as in the recent period due to the pandemic. So unemployment started to increase due to the fact that the economy started to slow down. So when we try to understand these fluctuations in economic activity, we know what we could expect in terms of unemployment rate, for instance, especially when you reach that phase of recession. And similarly, we can also try to understand the impact, particularly on price level. So when the economy started to recover, people started to spend, you know, and this is where at certain stage, you know, the demand might be exceeding the level of output in the economy, because for production, you know, it takes time in order for them to recover. And what's more, if there is a supply shock, you know, because of war, that basically leads to much larger inflationary pressure, you know, in the economy. So what I'm trying to highlight here, you know, especially in the general sense, when we try to look at the business cycle, the fluctuations in economic activity, the recession is basically associated with the problems of unemployment. And when it comes to economic recovery, when you started to expand, you know, that might also contribute towards another problem, which is inflation. And if you try to refer back to what really happened in the context of Malaysia, especially in the period of 1990s, this was the period where, as I said earlier, Malaysia was considered to be one of the Asian tigers. We reached high level of economic growth during this period. With that level of economic growth, you know, to some extent, it also affects our inflation rate. So you can see that in the period of the late 1980s and also in the early 1990s, there have been a significant increase in the price level due to expansion of the economy, due to the fact that the economy started to boom, you know, people started to demand more of goods and services, and to some extent, you know, output might not be able to catch up with the level of demand in the economy, and that basically gives some pressure to the price level. And if you try to read through economics textbook, you will also find Phillips curve, which basically describe about the trade-off between inflation and also unemployment. The next diagram that I'm sharing with you here is basically describing about the context of the United States. So the United States also, they record and they identify in terms of their business cycles. And, you know, the grayish line that is basically describing about the period of recession. So what I want to highlight here, when we talk about business cycles, it differs from one country to another, especially in terms of the length of the phases that they have to go through. In some countries, the recession might continue still. In some other countries, you know, they manage to basically recover very fast from the pandemic. And number two is in terms of the magnitude, the intensity of the problem. It really depends a lot in terms of the fundamentals of the economy, whether they have a very strong fundamentals to support whatever fluctuations or volatility that they have in the economy. So certain countries, when we talk about facing the pandemic, it affected them severely. In some other countries, you know, it's not as bad as relative to other countries. Okay, so it differs from one to another based on the context of the country and also based on the fundamentals of the economic that the country has. So when we describe about fluctuations, you might then wonder, you know, what are the reason behind this? Why there are ups and downs in economic activity? In the context of Malaysia alone, I showed to you, starting from 1980s, you know, we had faced 4 different business cycles in general, 4 different crises, you know, up until the most recent one. But how do we really explain, you know, why certain countries have the opposite, for instance, or why some other countries facing much more difficulty in addressing the problems? So I try to highlight few of those. Of course, there are so many other factors, but normally we try to explain in the context of shocks in the demand and supply. When we say shocks in the demand and supply, this is basically affecting the production, and partly it's might be due to drop in demand. So among other things that I have highlighted here, one would be political events, right? So whether a country is facing a war, for instance, you know, certainly that gonna affect in terms of the production level. So the supply might be very limited, and then that basically gonna bring down the economy, you know, to a bad situation. And if, you know, 2 countries, they sign peace treaties, you know, which promote trade between countries, that might give the opposite effect, whereby it might create more businesses opportunities, and this is where output will then start to increase, you know, employment opportunities going to increase, and income level for the economy also going to increase. So different countries, you know, having different phases and different scenario altogether. You know, in some places there is war, in some places they are having regional cooperation, and this basically explain a lot in terms of why the economy fluctuates over different period of times. We can also explain in the context of changes in resource quantity and also quality. When we talk about resource quantity, partly, of course, we can also relate with the first one, political events. In the context of war, for instance, we know the war between Ukraine and Russia has somehow affected the supply chain. So many of the products that we use, to produce final products, the intermediate products could not be imported, or there is a bit of delay, in getting those products to some extent that basically affects the production process, and therefore it affects in terms of the output level in several economies. But what I try to highlight here in my example is in terms of the labor market change. Whenever there is a new minimum wage regulation imposed in an economy, for instance, that's certainly going to affect in terms of the labor market. And since labor is, a very important input, for production, in a way, it also going to affect production at the later stage. Level of education, how this level of education, whether the quality has improved a lot, whether there have been more focus by the government to set up more technical institutions, to promote vocational kind of skills, for instance, that can also promote much higher labor supply, and therefore, it can also give some shock, to the economy. So when I talk about shock here, it can either be, positive shock, or it can either be negative shock, depending on the scenario that we are talking about. And then another point that I also want to share here is on monetary factors. This is something related to monetary policy, the role of the central bank, in order for them to achieve certain macroeconomic objective, they're going to make use of money supply, okay, as a way how to promote the economy, for instance. And to some extent, any changes in monetary policy, either by increasing the money supply, it might also going to affect in terms of the interest rates in the economy. And these changes in money supply and also interest rates will basically going to lead to changes in terms of how people perceive, particularly in the context of cost of borrowings. So when the loans getting cheaper, so people would basically feel that they have the advantage to borrow more now, and that basically may lead to much larger borrowings, and eventually will be translated into spending, for instance. And other factors, including financial instability, productivity levels, those are also among the factors that may explain why there is a shock in the economy, why our economic activity basically fluctuates. What I have here is basically some data. This is actually taken from Wikipedia. I tried to search for economic crisis. Okay, I tried to type economic crisis, and it's interesting to see that, the kind of economic crisis that we have in the global context, the more recent trend is basically more towards financial crisis. So if you look at the period of 21st century, right? Some of what being highlighted here, for instance, related to banking crisis, this is mortgage crisis, this is financial crisis, banking crisis, financial crisis, banking crisis. Okay, and then this is also related to financial sustainability, because the government is also borrowing. like the more recent scenario, what we have in the context of Sri Lanka, for instance, that is also an example of a crisis that originating on the part of financial instability, right? So, meaning that certainly there is something flaw, in the financial system, in the conventional financial system, because you could see all these things going on, and the occurrence basically becoming larger and larger and more frequent, that affects basically different countries. And then usually when we start to look at the problem when you have these fluctuations in economic activity, like what I mentioned to you earlier, we're going to focus on the two major problems. One is unemployment, and then the other one is inflation. Let me just go very briefly. And of course, you can try to learn more about this. So number one, when we talk about unemployment, the indicator is basically the unemployment rate. And there is a specific formula to calculate this. And most of the time, the way how a country basically estimate the unemployment rate will be, on the basis of survey. Like the case of Malaysia, we have a monthly labor survey, okay, to basically get some expected numbers when it comes to unemployment rate. And, one specific issues with regards to unemployment rate, because this is not real-time punya data. This is not real-time data, okay? And because it is based on survey, and of course, surveys has some limitations. So the unemployment rate might not accurately represent, the nature of unemployment in the economy. What's more, if we are talking about the difficulty in getting data, for some countries which doesn't have a proper database, or institutions, to compile all the economic indicators and so on. But in the economic sense, when we talk about unemployment, we usually try to understand the nature of unemployment. Why it is important for us to understand the different types of unemployment, because these different types of unemployment will explain to the policymaker in terms of the priority, that they need to address when it comes to unemployment. So the first two, frictional and also structural unemployment, these are basically what also we call as natural rate of unemployment. When we say natural rate of unemployment, it basically refers to the fact that, this kind of unemployment are unavoidable. So to be a bit more specific to you guys, when we talk about frictional unemployment, this basically refers to those people who are moving from one job to another job. So in between, before they secure another job, they are unemployed, and we consider this as frictional unemployment. So it's just a matter of time for them to enter again into the workforce and then secure a job. Okay, so it's not something which is very important, because it's just a transition point from one job to another job. And another example would be fresh graduates who are still looking for jobs, right after they graduated. It might take time for them to basically send out their resumes, go for interview. And then before they got the job, they are basically unemployed, and they basically fall under the category of frictional unemployment. The structural unemployment, this basically refers to people who are unemployed because of changes in the labor market. Technology improve, so certain things or certain jobs would become extinct. previously in Malaysia, when we want to make use of the toll road, highways, okay, we have to pay, for instance, to the toll collector. So there is a booth, and then someone basically going to collect. More recent scenario, because of the technology, we now just have to touch card, okay, at the post, and then you can basically, make use of the highway without paying cash, to the toll collector. So there is no longer a toll collector available at the toll booth. So, this kind of position or job, in certain parts of the economy, it started to become extinct because of changes in the labor market due to technological improvement and so on. Among the three types of unemployment, what is most important and what is really the concern of the government is actually the cyclical unemployment. So this cyclical unemployment is mainly due to the cyclical fluctuations in the economic activity. It's basically due to recession phase, for instance, whereby people gonna be laid off, workers will become unemployed, and this cyclical unemployment, become larger and larger over time if the recession becomes more intense and become more severe, for instance. So if we are talking about Great Depression, for instance, Great Depression, the level of cyclical unemployment during that time reaching almost about 20 to 25%. Okay, during the pandemic, if I could remember it correctly, for the case of United States, it had reached almost 10%. But the Great Depression, it's much higher than that. It reached up to 20 to 25% for many advanced economies, including the United States and UK during that period, especially in the late 1920s up until the end of 1930s, Great Depression. So what are the consequences of unemployment? What are the impact? Number one, if we try to look from the economics perspective, of course, when people are not contributing to the economy, they are no longer working, meaning that the resource utilization in the economy also gonna fall. And this basically gonna affect the output level. So when you cut down number of employees, that also means you're going to cut down the production. So there will be loss of national output. Remember earlier when we talk about output, why it's very important? Because this output going to generate income to the economy. So not only people are losing income, but in the whole economy, we are also losing output level. And there is a specific law, what we call as Auckland's law in the economy, whereby it tried to explain that whenever there is a 1% cyclical unemployment, it will basically going to create 2% of GDP gap. So GDP gap is the amount of output that you have to sacrifice because of the fact that you have certain percentage of cyclical unemployment. So the ratio between cyclical unemployment and the GDP gap, or the output that you have to sacrifice because of this cyclical 1 to 2. So in other words, if I'm talking earlier about Great Depression, if the unemployment rate is around 20%, in the United States during that time, so the output level that they lost, during that period is twice that number. Okay, so almost 40% of fall, in terms of output that they're supposed to be able to produce. And because of that ratio of 1 to 2, it shows how serious is the problem, because any impact on unemployment will give a huge impact, to the production in the economy. And then, of course, we can also explain in terms of the fiscal cost to the government. Many economies, especially the developed countries, they also provide what you call as employment benefits, unemployment benefits. Okay, so as more and more people become unemployed, they will get that unemployment allowance, and that basically incur costs for the government. Okay, so government expenditure also going to increase, and we always need to remember that the government, in terms of the fund that they have, it's also limited, and they also have certain constraints on that. And when it comes to the individual who become unemployed, of course, we are talking about lower spending power, and then, he or she might be indebtedness. He couldn't pay mortgage, for instance, and so many other things. It also may affect, the multiply effect. I think I'll just skip this part. I just want to go quickly to other things. And then the social costs, social deprivations, leads to crime, widening inequality of income, and so on. And if we try to also understand in terms of more of contemporary issue on unemployment, for instance, the trend is that, especially in many advanced economies like the United States, okay, what I have here is the labor force participation rate. Labor force participation rate is basically referring to the ratio of people who are in the working age who are in the workforce. So the trend in the United States and in many other economies is that there is a declining trend, whereby more and more people who supposed to be in labor force within that age of, working age, okay, they are basically leaving. They quit their job and they no longer become part of the labor force. And this is a kind of the trend that we are seeing, in US, in Japan, in many other countries. And I believe in the upcoming sessions, there will be a session by Dr. Naha to talk more about the labor market. And I believe, you can also ask questions related to any of these issues. There is also an issue of beyond market employment. And this is specifically related to developing countries and also, many Muslim countries, whereby, some of the types of work that they do, it's informal. Okay, it's informal. So it's not being recorded officially, especially if we are talking about less developed country, whereby individuals, helping their parents, for instance, or, they are, assisting in family business that, is not officially registered. So that is where we have what we call as underemployment. So this is considered to be beyond market employment. So when we say beyond market employment, meaning that the proportion of the unemployment rate or the employed are not being fully captured, okay, because of the technical difficulties in basically gathering the data for those who are working under or beyond the market employment. And today we are also talking about aging society and low birth rate. So the workforce, becoming smaller and smaller over time, over the past decades. And this certainly affect, in terms of production level, because like what I said, inputs is one, labor is one of the important inputs. Certain countries, they try to come up with certain policies to encourage migration, for instance, like the case of Australia, because of the limited numbers of workers that they have, they encourage migration. In certain years, they open up and they specify certain kind of skills that they require, and they may allow, people to basically migrate and consider to work there, for instance. And then the next one is inflation. So inflation, we are talking about general level of prices increase in the economy. When we say general level of prices, we are basically referring to a collection of goods. And this collection of goods is what we call as market basket. So when you want to monitor prices in the economy, you are not basically monitoring or looking at every single product's prices. What you're going to look at and what you're going to monitor would be a collection of goods. And this collection of goods are essentially goods that are highly consumed by the people in the economy. And this is what we call as market basket. So for Malaysia, for instance, what being consumed by Malaysian consumers is certainly different from other parts of the world. Okay, we consume more of rice, for instance, instead of wheat. Okay, so the collection of goods differs from one country to another country, depending on the culture, depending on the nature, of the people. And there is a specific standards in terms of, how to report this. Essentially, in the context of the international standards, normally we're going to break it down into 12 different categories, from food, transportation, communication, housing, medical, and so many other categorization. And each categories of all these different collection of goods carries different weightage. Again, depending on what the people in your country consume most. So the kind of category of goods that highly consumed by the people or being mostly where the money being spent on, it will basically carry much larger weightage when they want to calculate this consumer price index. Okay, so the consumer price index is basically the indicator to explain about the price level in the economy. And apart from CPI, consumer price index, we also have producers price index that is looking from the perspective of producers making use of different kind of goods as their inputs. So it's certainly different from the consumers, what consumers purchase. So the collection of the market basket is also different on their part. Okay, but the CPI and PPI are essentially interrelated. When PPI's producers price index started to increase, you could also expect that the price of goods will then increase. Consumer price index will then also going to increase. Let me just try to highlight the types of inflation. I think this is very important. So there are two ways how to look at the causes of inflation. Number one is what we call as demand pull inflation. When we say demand pull inflation, this basically happens due to the demand side, which basically relates to increase in spending, of the people in the economy, either by household or by businesses or by the government sector. So when there is continuous significant increment, in demand for goods and services, one thing that I mentioned earlier is that, for the supply, for the output level, it might not be able to catch up as fast as the demand. And when this thing happens, this is where the goods become, you will have problems of shortage. And whenever there is a problems of shortage, this is where the prices started to increase because people are bidding up, to get that same pool of goods that is available in the economy. And eventually this gonna affect, the entire economy through this, supply chain, for instance. And what's more, if we are talking about shortage of important items in the economy like chicken, beef, and so on, food stuff, that might also lead further to inflation. So that is one angle. The other angle is basically to look from the perspective of the cost push inflation. When we talk about cost push inflation, this is coming from the producers' point of view, whereby the producers, they may push the costs to the consumers because they have to incur much higher costs on their side. And why they have to incur much higher costs, might be because of few reasons. Number one, because of supply shock, for instance. There is a supply shock in terms of food nowadays, because of war, because of the pandemic. Even Malaysia, we import a lot of, food stuff. So due to limited supply in the supply chain, producers basically have to incur much larger costs. And therefore, when they want to sell to the consumers, they are pushing these costs, to the consumers. So that is why we use the term cost push inflation. Another example of cost push inflation would be, whenever there is a new tax imposed by government or by policymaker, whereby producers will have to bear or will have to incur that additional cost to be paid to the government, and firms might transfer this burden, to the consumer. So eventually, it will gonna affect the supply chain, and it also gonna affect the entire products in the economy. So when we talk about increase in the price of oil in the world market, so that one we can relate with cost push inflation, because the cost of oil per barrel increase. So meaning that, it affects the producers who provide transportation services and so on. So they will basically pass on that burden to the consumer. And of course, for policymaker, they have to really identify. It's not that clear-cut, whether the economy is facing demand pull inflation or cost push inflation. Like what we are facing today, basically it's a combination of both, because the economy is basically recovering, and at the same time, there is a supply shock because of war, and that basically also complement, further upward trend of the inflation rate. Okay, so I think I'll just move on. I think I'm a bit behind the schedule. We are moving to the second part, but I think because I have around 10 minutes or so, I'll just try to be a bit quicker here. I think certain things I can just leave it to you guys to read on your own when you have these slides. But let me just go back to this one. So now we are talking about stabilization policy, the role of policymakers. There are two ways to look at this. Number one is from the perspective of fiscal policy, and then the other one is basically monetary policy. Monetary policy, we had discussed this much earlier last week, I think. So I'm going to focus on fiscal policy. So when we talk about fiscal policy, this is basically active role of the government, federal government, as a way how to address any economic problems, either recession or inflation. And when we talk about fiscal policy, this is basically relates to government spending, or whenever the government makes some changes in terms of the tax structure. And the idea is basically, for what reason, for what purpose? It's basically to address the cyclical fluctuations that we described earlier, either in the context of inflation or recession. So let us just go a bit more deeper in terms of where does this fiscal policy originates from. So if you try to understand the context, in the period of 1920s, okay, the late of 1920s, if I'm not mistaken, around 1928, And then it continues until 1939. We had a Great Depression. And, prior to that event, we had a school of economics, what we call as classical economics, which believes that government shouldn't intervene much, in the market. So they believe more on the role of the market. So Adam Smith, for instance, make use of the term the invisible hand, which describe that, let the market works on its own. And they do not kind of in agreement with the role of government if the government intervene excessively. But during that Great Depression, initially they thought that the problem could be solved automatically by the market. Okay, but that was not happening, and the recession become even severe, and it continues for so many years. We are not talking about just 2 years. We are talking almost reaching up to 9 years of recession. So in response to that, another economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes came up with a new economic model and also economic framework, whereby he tried to promote the idea that there is a need for government intervention more actively in order to increase demand in the economy. Why? Because he believes that demand basically provide good signals to the producers. And on the part of the government, they have this power to basically create demand, because government is also one of the agents that going to spend in the economy. So Keynes specifically proposed a planned increase in spending on the part of the government. And this can be either through, new projects, infrastructure projects, by embarking on new infrastructure projects or new programs. For instance, this basically gonna trickle down to the industry. They have to supply, all those materials, and then this will also gonna generate new employment opportunities, and then slowly gonna increase the income level so that people could spend in the economy. So that's basically the main idea. So even if you look at the trend prior to the Great Depression, in terms of government debt, okay, it was very minimal. In fact, it was trivial. But upon the introduction of this Keynesian economics, whereby they propose the fiscal policy measures as a way how to promote economic growth, as a way how to stimulate the economy during recession, this is where, from the period of 1930s onwards, you started to see more and more government to basically increase the government expenditure beyond, what they really earn from their revenues. So the amount of tax collected was not even sufficient, to cover what they spend. So that is where we started to hear, the term fiscal deficit, okay, or budget deficit, okay, in which it originates, from this theoretical framework brought upon by Keynesian. And if you try to look at the data that we have today, the trend of this government spending had become larger and larger and larger over time, especially in the period of 1960s and also 1970s, as a way how to reconstruct their economy after the World War II. And borrowings also started to increase, and government debt also started to increase larger and larger and larger. up until today. And I think in a session that you're going to have with Dr. Irwan, he will talk more about public finance, and then he will discuss more in terms of any statistics or any data related to government debt and also budget deficit. So this is basically the intuition behind it, but I'll just want to skip this part. I think I have just few more minutes. So the basic idea here is Keynes proposed that for an economy, when we want to measure our output level, this output level basically can be explained by level of spending in the economy. And this level of spending originates from different sectors in the economy. The C is basically describing about expenditure by household in the economy. This is basically expenditure by businesses in terms of investment. So that is where the alphabet I come from. And then this is basically, the government expenditure. So the government can specifically play their role in embarking on fiscal policy by making use of this G component. And then XN is basically describing about external sector, export and import. So according to Keynes, when you sum up all the total level of spending in the economy, that basically going to explain about the GDP. So what happened, for instance, if there is a decline in investment, assuming other factors constant, right, you could expect that the GDP might fall. So what he tried to explain is that since the government can make use of their financing in order to increase the G, for instance, that would be a way how to compensate any decline in any of government spending, in any of the decline in any of other types of spending here. And of course, in Islamic economics, okay, we have a specific guiding principles when it comes to government spending, although we say that government spending or fiscal policy is very important. But in a way, we have to take note that, this excessive government spending may lead to much larger debt burden, okay, and deficit, for instance. And therefore, Muslim jurists provide a very general guidelines. When it comes to government spending, it has to be moderate. And number two, it has to be based on priorities. Okay, and this is where the categorizations of what you call that as the Daruriyah, the Hajiyah, and the Tahsiniyah, the aim of Sharia, the objective of Sharia becomes very relevant, because the way how the government gonna spend, as a way how to make use the resources that they have would be based on the priorities, according to Maqasid al-Sharia. And in fact, if you try to search, this is originating from the Ottoman Civil Code, during the 18th and also early 19th century. There is a proper legal document which basically describe clearly in terms of the role of government. So you can read there, all public expenditure should be aimed at meeting the welfare of the people. This is during the Ottoman period. And this specifically had been cited by Monzakaf, one of our Islamic economists, in his work, which describe about government financing and also government expenditure. And then we also have zakah. Okay, we have to remember that in the context of Islamic economics, these instruments that we have in a way, it also plays an important role to address economic problems. So we also consider, the zakah as part of fiscal policy measures. But we also need to understand that this zakah cannot be considered as fiscal tool per se, because you cannot consider zakat as the same as tax. Okay, because zakah, number one, this is a religious tax, religious injunctions, whereby it has to be collected, by the Muslim state at all times, regardless of economic situation. Tax, in the case where the economy is not doing very well, policy makers might reduce the tax, for instance, but not for the case of zakah. So certain rules applies for the case of zakah. And when we talk about the rates, the nisab, it's basically fixed and cannot be manipulated. And there is also a specific recipients, okay, beneficiaries of zakah divided into the 8 asnaf. So there are clear injunctions with regards to the rulings of zakah, and these basically differentiate really in terms of zakah and tax lah. All right. So although when we look from the perspective of the functions of zakah, it can still play a role in addressing some of the macroeconomic issues. So for instance, here I'm trying to highlight that when it comes to redistribution of income, certainly, through the zakah, this is where the better off members, share their wealth to the lower income bracket groups. So that is part of the income redistribution initiative. And then you can also consider zakah as providing stabilization initiative or policy. Okay, because on the part of the policy maker, they can consider, giving some exemptions with regards to tax payment for those people who are, paying zakah, for instance, certain tax being lifted, just to encourage people to pay more, to fulfill their duties as a Muslim, for instance. And then zakah also can promote economic growth, because whatever money received, by the recipients, they're gonna make use of this, and eventually the money gonna circulate and then move on from one hand to another hand. It will then create, multiplier effect, and this basically gonna generate, new output in the economy. So whenever there is a new spending in the economy, especially by those people who receive the zakah money in order for them to fulfill their needs, that basically gonna generate demands and then output, which eventually, gonna contributes to economic output in the economy. So I think I should stop there. This is actually my final slides, but I think you can read on your own. At the larger context, we can also explain the effects of zakah and how it basically affects the macroeconomic context. All right, so thank you very much. I end my session there. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
So much, Dr. Noorihsan, for your sharing. Especially the first part when you recap, every lectures that we have, that kind of help us to organize whatever we have learned before. So thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for the whole sharing, for 1.5 hours of sharing. We wish we have more time to listen from you, right? So maybe we can take some question from the floor. Giving the time, maybe around 3 to 4 questions, inshallah, right? So Doctor, the first question. What is the relationship between increases in the money supply or money printing by central banks and inflation? Does it affect inflation at all?
Okay, so the question is with regards to money supply. So the idea is this: the one who manage money in circulation is the central bank. And of course, I think you learned previously, that in the current system that we are making use today, in the modern banking system, there is also a process what we call as money creation. Okay, because the system that we are applying now is basically what we call as fractional reserve banking system. So when money in circulations increases, that basically gonna leads to greater spending. Okay, assuming that people are having easy access to money when they apply for loans, for instance, they get the approval easily. And when people started to spend, and this basically gonna create greater demand in the economy. Like what I said earlier, whenever the demand started to pick up and the supply are not able to catch up with the high level of demand, this basically gonna create what we call as demandful inflation. Okay, so the relationship in the theoretical perspective, yes, whenever there is an increase in money supply, that basically would be expected to gonna affect the price level in the economy, and that is why on the part of the central bank, the reason being why they control the money is basically because they want to achieve certain objective. So if there is inflation, for instance, so what they're gonna do is that they're gonna limit the amount of money in circulation. Okay, they're gonna cut down the money supply in circulation to make sure that the spending level also gonna reduce in the economy, so that can basically curb inflation. I hope that would answer your question.
All right, thank you, Doctor. Second question, you said macroeconomic situation differs from one country to another, but prominent international financial institutions do encourage countries to adopt some policies irrespective of their situation. What can you say about this?
Personally, I think there are certain general guidelines to promote economic, development and also growth. But certain things might not be effective in certain places. I would say, certain this universal recipe, might not be applicable to all. It really depends a lot in terms of the nature of the economy, the people, how they perceive and how they accept it. For instance, I'll give you one example. In the period of 1980s, there was huge advocacy for countries to go for privatization. And specifically here, I'm talking about telecommunication sector. Okay, especially in the period of 1980s, at the end of 1980s, even Malaysia, we privatized our telecommunication sector. Previously, it was under the government, but then we privatized it in the late 1980s. Even Mexico during that time, in the period of 1980s, Argentina, they make use of the same recipe. Go for privatization. But based on studies, they found that in certain countries, although they make use of the same ingredients, okay, the same way, how to go about in doing the privatizations and so on, the outcome is different. When I say the outcome here, I'm referring to, the initial expectation for privatization is to improve efficiency level. So that would be your expectation. Okay. But in many countries, such as in Latin America, for instance, Argentina and Mexico, although they started to privatize, but the results is becoming even worse. The quality of service did not improve. And partly the way how we explain this is because of the institutional that they have to support, those initiatives. Whether there is corruption or not, for instance. So although they privatize, but that privatization basically took place and being given, to the cronies, for instance, So at the end, not much of improvement being done. And secondly, it depends a lot in terms of the level of democracy. Certain countries, there have also been studies that look in terms of the effectiveness of reform. Okay, it depends a lot whether you are a democratic country, whether you are having a monarchy, because whatever being proposed might not really be relevant in the context, because the way how people respond might be different. The effectiveness of the policy maker who gonna take up that role might not be the same as expected. So all those sometimes might bring hiccups. Okay, so it's very important to really understand the scenario that every economy has in order for us to choose the best policy initiative. I give you another example. When we would like to initiate 5G, for the case of Malaysia, or even before that 3G, different countries basically applies different technique in giving out that projects, to the respective companies. Some, they will go for auction. Okay, so the policy maker, they're gonna come out with auction. So companies who would like to bid, to take up these 5G projects, basically to provide the infrastructure, will have to bid in the auction. But in some other countries, that doesn't work. They prefer, in the context of beauty contest, they call it. So every different companies, they're going to present to the government, and then the government will evaluate, what would be the best company for them to choose in order to be awarded that contract, for instance, for 5G. So it really depends a lot in terms of the nature and also the level of readiness at the institutional level.
All right, thank you, Doctor. Maybe one last question, this one with regards to Islamic economy. Fiscal policies encourage government involvement in the economy, while global trade requires government to reduce their role in the economy. How should the Islamic economy be?
Sorry, could you please repeat, Zera?
Fiscal policies encourage government involvement in the economy, while global trade requires government to reduce their role in the economy. How should the Islamic economy be?
The way how I see it is that you can't really decide between the two options that you highlight earlier, which one to choose from. I think it has, in a way, to be a mixture of both, because every country have, certain interests as well. Okay, we are talking about national interest to protect, our local producers, for instance. So in some cases, we might be a bit protective when it comes to international trade. We might not want to lift up, any tariff whatsoever, because there is a specific reasons that we want to address. We know the capability of our local producers. We know that, they are still, the advanced stage whereby they try to learn, and they might not be able to compete with global players. So if that is the scenario, then it might be appropriate for you to have that, policy initiative. But in other contexts, it really depends on, how you look at it. So it might be a mixture of both, but the main focus would be, of course, something that can benefits the public interest overall. Okay, when we talk about Islamic economics, the main overall context that we are looking at is more towards the maslahah, okay, of the ummah. And from there, we can basically judge and evaluate what would be the best, whether it can basically promote, the maqasid sharia. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Doctor, for your response. I think that is how much a question that we can take. We need to take a break for me to prepare for my session. Okay, I need a moment a moment of transition between moderators and also speaker. So for that, thank you, Dr. Noorihsan, for your time. And dear participants, let's take a break around 10 minutes or 12 minutes. We'll start inshallah at 11 a.m. Malaysian time. Right? Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
All right. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Can all of you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. I just want to confirm that this was so silent. Anyway, a very good morning and welcome back to this event session. So today, let us continue with the next session, which will be presented by Dr. Zera Zuryana Idris. Before I invite her to give her talk, let me introduce her to all of you. She's currently a lecturer, assistant professor at the International Islamic University, Malaysia. Prior to her employment here, she did her bachelor degree and also master degree in economics at this university. And then after that, she pursued her PhD in economics also in the University Putra Malaysia, UPM. And before she pursued her PhD in UPM, she did work at she worked as assistant director at the Multilateral Trade Policy and Negotiation Division in the Ministry of Trade and Industry Malaysia, also known as MITI. And in this division, she served the WTO unit for the first 9 months. And then after that, she worked at the Trade Practices section. She also worked at Mantrade in the Lifestyle and Life Sciences section. Okay, so she joined our Kuliah of Economics and Management Sciences in 2022. So she already has written several articles and published them in both local and also international journals. So today, she's going to present two topics. The first one is international economic trade and cooperation, number one, and then also after that continuation for the second section of international economic trade and cooperation. So without further ado, I would like to invite her. And before that, before I forget, we let her give the talk, and then after the presentation, then only we allow Q&A. And also, for Q&A, please write your question in the chat section here in Zoom. So please, Dr. Zera.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Intan. Let me share my screen. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Intan Zanaria, for introducing me. She is actually another member of our department. Thank you so much for your willingness to moderate my session. Okay, giving up your Sunday. May Allah bless you on that. Okay. Actually, for this particular speaker, the participant may not need a long introduction because we technically have been together almost every week. Just that this week, she has been given the opportunity to talk more than 2 minutes. Okay, so as you can see from the schedule, there is a slight changes. Okay, in which International Economics, Trade and Cooperation Part 2 was supposed to be delivered by Professor Rukia Lavi, but unfortunately she cannot make it today. She can't be with us. Therefore, you have no choice but to listen to me for at least 90 minutes. All right. We plan and Allah plans, inshallah, this is for the better. Okay, this is what Allah has planned and has in store for us. Okay, so topic or schedule given module that we are going to discuss with me today is the International Economics, Trade and Cooperation, Part 1 and Part 2. So under this umbrella, these are the things that I am going to discuss. Okay. So whenever we try to approach a topic, okay, a particular topic, it's best to develop a context of what we want to talk about. Therefore, I choose to start with the definition of international economics. It might be basic, but I note that I acknowledge that there is a various background of our participants. Some might not have any knowledge of economics in general, or international economics in particular. But some might have, advanced knowledge, even advanced than me maybe, right? Therefore, I think taking into consideration these various backgrounds of our participant, it will be best to first visit the definition of international economics, just to develop the context, right? And then I'll talk about the evolution of trade theories. Okay, by talking about the evolution of trade theories, I'm not trying to be really theoretical. Really theoretical, okay? So don't be burdened by the words theory. Sometimes when you heard theory, it feels heavy, okay? So what we are trying to do or trying to obtain from understanding the evolution of trade theories is that we are trying to see why countries trade, okay? How they do trade, and also some of the implication of trade, all right? And connecting our topic today with our certificate program, therefore, I'm going to talk about international trade from Islamic perspective. Okay. Honestly, while preparing for this class, for this particular lecture, this part is quite challenging because if you visit textbooks on international trade in particular, it's the discussion from Islamic perspective is quite limited. Okay, most probably because most of the textbooks are written by the Western scholars and also written in the conventional context, from the conventional context, right? But we try to do this. We try to discuss Islamic perspective on international trade by referring to some of our Muslim scholars, write up from our Muslim scholars, inshallah. All right. So I hope that caters for 45 minutes. And then after that, we'll talk about international trade policy. There are various trade policies, of course, but I'm not going to touch on everything. I'm just trying to see, things that are in general trade policy, right? And then we're going to talk about economic integration, which also will touch about the cooperation among countries or among economies. Okay. And then, if time permits, I'll highlight a bit from about the trend in global trade. Okay, what is going on right now? Who are the main players and so on? And also, finally, I will maybe highlight about some of the way forward when in the context of international trade. Okay, I'm not sure whether this content is enough or more for 1.5 hour session. Let's see what we have it. How it goes. Okay. If we don't have much time, then I will have to skip some of the topics, right? Okay. So, okay, as I said just now, it is important to develop or to understand the definition of a particular subject that we want to approach or we want to try to understand. Okay. Now, just now, Dr. Noorihsan has helped us where he recap what we have learned in detail. Okay, but I'm trying to recap, to start with this, I'm trying to recap whatever we have learned from our previous classes in a very simple manner, okay? So economics as a sign, before this, we understand economics as a sign, we say we can divide economics into two main components, which we can discuss from microeconomics perspective, okay, where we have all the individuals, household, individuals, firms, individual countries even, okay? And then we have the discussion of macroeconomics, all right? Where we discuss everything at the aggregate level, aggregate demand, aggregate supply and things, all right? So apart from these two components to the economics as a science, okay, there are many sub-branches of economics. Okay, there are also other sub-branches of economics. We have development economics, for example, where we talk about poverty, we talk about inequality, okay, income distribution, and so on. We also have environmental economics, where we talk about all the environment. We have labor economics. We also have health economics, yeah, in which Dr. Intan Zanaria is one of our experts, yeah, at our institution. Okay, so apart from this, we also have international economics. So international economics is part of one of the sub-branches to economics as a sign, all right? So these particular branches, okay, we deals with the economic and financial interdependence among nations, okay? So realize that from the sentence, okay, there are two main components to international economics. We can talk from international trade perspective, okay, where we have economic interactions. We can also talk from the international finance perspective, where we have financial interdependence among nations. If you go deeper, we can have much more deeper classification or deeper sub-branches to this. We can talk about international monetary system. We can also talk about international political system, right? So it's given that under international economics, there are a number of branches. Today, into this lecture, I just want to focus on international trade, okay? Because at least in my opinion, I believe that, the way to understand international economics should start from understanding this part, okay? Then only we'll talk about other components of international economics. There is no particular order, but just in my opinion, all right? So international economics as a whole, if you look at it as a whole, okay, we analyze the flow of goods, services, payments, monies, okay, between a particular nation and also the rest of the world. We also look at the policies directed at regulating these flows and some of the impact engaging in this international economics, right? So this is the context that we are going to talk about. As I said, I want to focus on international trade, inshallah, in this lecture. All right? So talking about international trade, okay, as simple as it may sound to some, okay, we can refer that to as the cross-border transaction involving products, or simply we can say exports and imports of goods and services, okay? That is in the context of international trade, all right? Or simply, okay, if you want to put in a layman terms, okay, we can say that international trade is actually just selling and buying across border, okay? So whenever we, okay, let's say Malaysia sells our rubber product to Indonesia, meaning we are exporting our product to Indonesia, all right? If let's say our African students come to study to UIE, that means Malaysia is exporting our educational services to African students, right? What about importing? Okay, importing is buying, okay, means I'm not sure about other countries, but here in Malaysia, we have, we are very familiar with platform called Shopee, right? Whenever you scroll your Shopee and you buy things, you can buy things from Indonesia, you can buy things from China, okay? That means you are importing goods from that particular nation, okay? And let's say if our students or our children go to perhaps United States to further their study, that means we are importing, okay, the education services, okay, from USA. Okay, of course, there are a number of ways in which export and import of services can take place, and that requires a different or a separate explanation. Okay, but at least you understand what do we mean by that, especially for those who does not have background in economics or international economics, right? So while preparing for this lecture, I've been thinking, how should I organize the materials, okay, for it to be easy for the participant to understand about these particular topics. So I've come with this diagram here, a simple diagram that at least at the end of this lecture, okay, here are the things that you should be able to answer. First is why, okay, in the context of international trade, we want to see why countries do trade, okay? And then we want to look, how do they do trade? Or how does trade take place, okay? And also we want to be able to capture some implications of engaging in trade. So here are the learning outcome, expected learning outcome, at least from this lecture, okay? Okay, so let's try to answer the first question of why do nation trades, okay? To answer this, we need to look at the economic basis for trade, okay? So if you look at international trade, this is actually a way or a tool for nation to specialize, okay, in the certain production of products. Okay, by doing so, they can increase the productivity of their economic resources. Okay, when that happens, they can eventually realize a larger total output. Okay, in that way, okay, they are technically better off. Okay, better off than if they try to use the economic resources to produce everything. Okay, so we believe that international trade will make a nation better off. Okay. There are at least 3 reasons for or rational, okay, rational for the international trade to take place. Okay, so the first one is the distributions of economic resources among nations is uneven. You may realize that some countries are landlocked countries, right? So they don't have maritime border. Okay, so for these countries, they might be been, might have been blessed with a larger land. Okay, therefore, okay, they can focus on the productions of goods that using more lands, like agriculture, for example. Okay, but for countries that have a maritime border, okay, they might have been blessed with economic resources such as fisheries product. Okay, for some countries that have capital, they don't have land, but they have a lot of capital, like Singapore, very small country, very limited numbers of land, but they have a lot of capital. So, because of this uneven economic distributions of economic resources, that calls or makes sense for countries to engage in international trade. All right. Number two, okay, another rationale for international trade is that some efficient production of various goods or some good, it may require different technologies or the combination of resources. Okay, so for example, if you're producing paddy here, okay, let's say you need certain machineries to produce paddy more efficiently, to have or experience efficient production, but you don't have this in your domestic country, a domestic economy. I mean, you don't have the machine produced in domestic economy. So what do you need to do? You need to buy this technology from somewhere else. Okay, for you to have efficient production of a particular product, you need to combine certain resources. Okay, and this also makes sense or provide a basis why we should engage in trade, why nation engage in trade. Okay, number three, okay, products are differentiated among nations and some people prefer imported goods. Okay, now imagine this, we produce car. Okay, Japan also produce car, Italy also produce car, right? But the car produced in Japan might be different than the one produced in Italy. Okay, and some people or some consumers in Japan might prefer the car produced in Italy. And some people or some consumer in Italy might prefer car produced in Germany. Now, because products are differentiated and we have, different preference, okay, it makes sense for a nation to engage in international trade. All right. Now, we understand, let us go further, okay, about understanding this economic basis for trade. We understand that nation differs in terms of the distributions of economic resources. We also are quite clear about, nations differ in terms of technologies. Different countries are good in different technologies, right? Now, because of these differences, okay, different countries can produce different goods. Some can produce labor-intensive goods. Okay, labor-intensive goods, meaning to produce this particular product, you use more or you require more labor input, okay, as compared or as proportionate to capital input. Okay, maybe we take example of apparel or clothing. Okay, to produce clothing, you need to use more labor as compared to machines. Therefore, clothing is known as labor-intensive goods. Okay. Okay, because some countries are blessed with abundance of labor, right? So these countries, labor-abundant countries, are known to be good at producing labor-intensive goods. Okay, but while some countries are good in producing capital-intensive goods, what do we mean by capital-intensive good? Capital-intensive good is basically a good that when you want to produce this particular good, you require more capital as compared to labor. Okay, one good example of this would be high technology products. Okay, if I may highlight maybe the production of contact lens, for example, right? So to produce contact lens, okay, you require most of the production process are done by machines. You maybe require less number of labor, just need to monitor the machines. Therefore, this particular goods, okay, is known as capital intensive goods. Goods, okay, in which the production require more capital inputs. All right. Okay, so here are just some example, of the economic basis for trade. For example, we have, if Indonesia has a large number of laborers, therefore they can specialize in labor-intensive commodities. If Australian has abundance of lands relative to human and capital resources, they can cheaply produce land-intensive agriculture products like apples, right? And for countries, okay, industrially advanced nation like Japan, okay, they are in a position to produce capital-intensive goods. Of course, when we talk about this, it's about the type of products that we can produce. Of course, the discussion at the real world is more complex. It's not as easy as simple as you may see here. Yeah, different. There are other factors that are taken into consideration when we discuss or when we talk about what product we want to export. Okay, all right. So up to the point where we discussed just now, just a basic one. Okay, up to this point, I hope that at the back of your mind, at least take 30 seconds to reflect. Okay, I hope that you can answer these questions. Why do nations trade? Okay, by highlighting or remembering the points of the economics the economic basis for trade, right? So I hope by this point you have that in mind, right? Let's proceed. We have understand why nation trade. Okay, now we want to understand how does trade take place. Okay, we want to understand what should we produce or what should we export. Okay, to do so, okay, I'm going to bring your attention to the evolution of trade theories. But as I said, okay, we are not trying to be theoretical here, really theoretical, okay? Given that we are, in the context of this program, okay, certificate in Islamic economics, I don't think there is a need to go really deep or really, very theoretically into each, okay? But we'll just go through it to get some gist of it, right? So here we have a timeline of the trade theories, okay? Not a really complete timeline, particularly at the end there. But then I'm just highlighting this to show that there are classification of trade theories, a bigger classification of trade theories that we can see. Okay, so in the earlier 16th to 18th centuries, we have the idea of mercantilist. That is how people decide to do trade. Okay, and then later on, when Adam Smith came in 1776, he wrote his book, and then that is the beginning of, we can say that is the beginning of classical thinkers, classical idea of trade, right? And then later on, after 19, okay, we have modern trade theories. Of course, the list I put there is not exhaustive. Okay, we have more. Okay, but just for this purpose, we need to understand the classification, at least the bigger classification of trade theories. Okay, let's try to look at it. Okay, one by one. So first, we discuss mercantilist idea of trade, and then I'll bring the discussion of classical idea, and then maybe if we have time, we'll touch some of the modern, because I believe that classical is quite important in establishing the what is the trade flow or trade ideas, right? So let's discuss about the mercantilist idea. Okay, as I said, if you feel it's very heavy, or you feel that the word theory is very heavy, drop that word. Okay, we just put in your mind that we want to study about mercantilist idea, okay, of trade. Okay, so their idea was that, okay, during that 16th to 18th century, okay, their idea was that the wealth and power of a nation, okay, are measured in terms of the amount of gold and reserve or silver reserve you have at hand, okay? Or they practice bullionism policy, okay? Bullions. The more bullions you have at hand, the better you are, okay? Therefore, with this ideology, the best way for a country to achieve economic growth, to achieve prosperity, was to make few imports and many export. Why do I say so? If you encourage more export, okay, when you export your products, okay, people need to pay to you. What are they paying off at that time? They are paying off in terms of gold and silver. And by that, you will have more gold and silver at hand. Okay? That is the way. They believe that that is the way to achieve prosperity. Okay? So, countries with this ideology, okay, last time, they competed to outperform each other in terms of trade expansion and also building up bullions. Okay, how do they compete? They compete through, okay, colonization of resource-rich countries, okay, like African, like ASEAN, okay. They even went to the extent of waging a war if there is a signs of threat that could weaken their control over the trade routes and also the raw materials, okay. So that is the idea of mercantilists. Therefore, okay, with that ideology, countries with a large colonial powers like British, like France last time, they were extremely prosperous. Okay, the principle or the dogma of mercantilism is that those colonies, okay, colonized nation, they are expected to supply the raw materials, okay, to support the development of domestic industry of their mother nation, and whatever needed in our country, in a colonized nation, be it manufactured product or be it non-manufactured products, okay, we need to import them from the colonial masters. So that was the principle during that time. Again, they did this, okay, with the aim to maximize export and also to reduce import. Okay, one of the example is that during that time, okay, the Staple Act has went through the British Parliament at that time, in which they prohibited, okay, in this act they prohibited any colonies to buy goods, okay, from other sources or to import goods from other sources other than their colonial masters, other than British at that time. Okay, for example, if we want to buy spices from India, okay, that must be done through British importer. Okay, again, their aim is to maximize their export. Even they have this Trade and Navigation Act to say that if you want to ship the product, say the spices that you bought from India, okay, you imported through British importer, you must use the British shipping line. Okay, again, why they do this? They want to maximize export. Why? Because to ensure the enlargement of bullions at hands. Yeah. Okay. Of course, this idea of mercantilists, they receive criticism. Okay. Many criticism, but I highlighted a few. You can see from our discussion that this kind of theory or this kind of idea of doing trade, okay, only benefited the wealthy. Of course, the idea of mercantilists has contributed at large to the economic growth of, British at that time, America. But what about the colonized nation? The colonized nation are still backward. Okay, so this kind of theory, it's only benefited the wealthy, right? Secondly, according to physiocrats, who are the physiocrats? Those are the thinkers during that time. Okay, so physiocrats at that time raised some concern about labor rights of workers who were exploited by the trading communities. Okay, when they did the trade expansion, okay, they come to colonized nation, they imposed certain policy or certain rules, okay, that violated the labor rights. So physiocrats at that time raised some concern about this. Also, they also warned about the overemphasis on manufacturing and commerce, okay, at that time. Okay, and they say that there is a need to reduce that overemphasis on manufacturing and commerce, and we need to put more focus on self-sufficiency in agriculture to ensure society welfare and growth. This idea of physiocrat at that time are still valid until today, if I may say, okay, where we have a lot of industrial revolution, we give emphasis on manufacturing and all, but at the same time, we also see that, countries are raising concern about the food security issues. Okay, so these thinkers, they already see this phenomena coming, right? Okay, now because of this criticism, there are a lot of criticism that time, but the government at that time doesn't really take it, okay, until Adam Smith came and wrote a book on the wealth of the nations, the famous book, Wealth of the Nation, okay, and in 1776, all right. So what has been written in the book? Okay, I think that the Noorihsan shared some of the gist just now, in which they are not really in favor of government restriction. Okay, So what Adam Smith wrote in his book is that first, government regulation, he said, created unwarranted impediments to people's daily life and progress. If you put so much regulation, that will hamper the progress of the people in terms of standard of living and so on. Okay, another criticism is that mercantilist policy is inward looking. Okay, it is biased against nations and in favor of the rich, which we have discussed just now, right? Another thing, important things that Adam Smith highlighted on the book or in the book is that heavy restrictions on imported goods cause more harm to society than created welfare. All right. So remember the story of spice just now. Okay. This restriction, we put restriction that if you want to buy this, you must go through our importer. Okay. This restriction, we believe that he believed that created more harm because by doing this, buying the spices through intermediary, we let the consumers to pay higher product. Okay, therefore this is create more harm that rather than creating a welfare. We can be better off if we don't have restriction and go to India straight directly to buy the spices. Okay, therefore based on this argument, so Adam Smith established a case of free trade. Okay, he want to show that if we don't have any restriction, if the society is let free, okay, we'll be better off. Okay, therefore, he come up with the idea of absolute advantage, right? So what is absolute advantage? Okay, absolute advantage is the term used in economics or in international economics in particular, yeah. So the word absolute advantage, it refers to the ability of a particular country, okay, to produce goods or services more efficiently than its competitor. Okay, if we are able to produce goods or services more efficiently compared to our competitor, meaning we have absolute advantage in the production of that product. Okay, so Adam Smith's idea was that countries should specialize in the production of and also export the commodities in which they have absolute advantage in, right? To discuss this further, okay, this idea further, Adam Smith developed a model. Okay, in economics we have a lot of models, a lot of assumptions, because we want to make a prediction about the economic flow. Okay, so to discuss this idea, Adam Smith developed a two countries and two commodities model in which he assumed that in this world we only have two countries and assume that these two countries are only producing two commodities. Okay, so by doing this, okay, he shows that trade allows specialization, and that would improve efficiencies, right? And he also showed that by doing specialization and engaging in trade, both trading partners could enjoy high level of output and consumption. Okay, now I want to put this in terms of hypothetical scenario. As I said, don't worry so much about, this is too technical or I think just try to get some idea of it, right? So now let's look at the hypothetical scenario of absolute advantage, because I believe that this is the best way, inshallah, for you to understand what do we mean by absolute advantage. Okay, so put your attention to the table in blue. Okay, that is the pre-specialization and pre-trade, of course, right? This is the in international economics, we call this autarky condition. Okay, condition where before a nation engage in specialization or international trade. Okay, so again, put your attention to the blue table here. Okay, here you can see we have two countries in the world. Okay, as I said, okay, we use two models, two by two models, yeah, two countries, two commodities, right? So we have two countries in this model. We have country A, we also have country B. Okay, and both countries are producing steel and corn, two commodities. Okay, look at country A. Okay, country A can produce 30 units of steel. Country B can produce 60 units of corn that made up a total of 90. Okay, what about country B? Country B can produce 60 units of steel and 30 units of corn, made up the total output for country B 90. In total, the world output is 180 in units. Of course, this is a simplified version, yeah? We measured everything in units. But looking at the number, okay, in the blue table, look at the steel column. Okay, in the production of steel, who is able between the two countries, who is able to produce more? Okay, of course, we look at country B. Country B is able to produce more steel, okay, as compared to country A. So simply, they are more efficient in producing steel, okay, as compared to country A. What about corn? Okay, look at the column on corn, the blue column. Okay, on corn. Okay, country A can produce more corn as compared to country B. That means they are able to use their economic resources better or efficient in the production of corn. Okay, keep looking at this pattern. Simply, Adam Smith said that, okay, then country B has absolute advantage in the production of steel and country A has absolute advantage on the production of corn. Therefore, you should specialize, okay, in the respective commodities. Okay, now look at the green table. Okay, bring your attention to the green table. If we believe or if we follow the idea of Adam Smith, country A should just focus on producing corn. They don't need to produce any of steel. You notice that the number of steel is 0. Don't use your economic resources to produce steel. Use everything to produce corn because you have the absolute advantage in doing so. Okay. Similarly goes to country B. Okay, because you have absolute advantage in producing steel, use every of your economic resources to use steel. Okay, don't focus on corn. This is what we call specialization. If you may realize, okay, through this hypothetical example, by doing specialization, we are able to experience more output, more total output. Okay, and each of the countries also experience more of the total output. And of course, later on, they can talk about trading this. Okay, but this is the first step, how to identify what product we should produce. So the key takeaways from this idea or this theory is that by doing specialization, okay, and division of labor and trade, we believe that producer with different absolute advantage can always gain more. Okay, all right. Now, in the real world, there can also be a case where one country have the absolute advantage in producing all commodities, both commodities. Okay, so we put in a hypothetical scenario again. Okay, it can be something like this. Okay, where we have country C and country D, and look at the number. Okay, country C are able to produce more steel as compared to country D, and also they also can produce more corn as compared to country D. Okay, in this case, okay, how do we decide, or how do we decide who should export what? How do we decide, okay, this one should focus on producing this, and the other should focus on producing the other? Okay, it seems like, okay, if you follow Adam Smith theory, it seems like only country C can produce both goods. Okay, so here is when David Ricardo come later on in 1870s, when he came and he said that even in this scenario, we are still able to do trade. Okay, now how do we decide which who to produce what? Okay, who should export what? Okay, he said that we look at the opportunity cost ratio. Okay, so I hope that you followed our previous classes before on microeconomics. I think maybe it was Prof Rokia who highlighted on the opportunity cost, the concept of opportunity cost. Okay, for you to understand this, you need to have the understanding of opportunity cost. But let me briefly, help you to understand or to read the opportunity cost, that particular column. Okay, now look at the production of steel. Okay, to produce 1 unit of steel, okay, country C need to forgo 1 unit of corn. Okay, to produce 1 unit of steel, country D need to forgo 2 units of corn. I put the way to get the number there. You can later on go back and try to understand this mathematically. Okay, but what I want to highlight is in terms of the opportunity cost. Given this scenario, who has the lowest opportunity cost in producing steel? I hope you are answering, on the other part of the world. Okay, we can see that country C, okay, has the lowest opportunity cost, okay, in producing steel. Okay, what about corn? Okay, to produce 1 unit of corn, country C need to forego 1 unit of steel. Okay, to produce 1 unit of corn, however, country D needs to forego only 0.5 unit of steel. Okay, now based on this, who has the lowest opportunity cost? Okay, of course, country D in the production of corn. Therefore, okay, country C should focus on producing steel and country D should focus on producing corn. Okay, so the idea from this comparative advantage is that countries should trade based on the based on the ability to produce a particular good or services at a lower opportunity cost than their trading partners. Okay, so if you don't understand, how do you get this opportunity cost? Of course, this is a bit mathematical or technical. It's okay. The idea is that the gist is that, okay, countries should focus or specialize and also export in the goods that they can that they have comparative advantage at or in. Okay, all right. So enough of the let's take a break of the theoretical discussion. Yeah, as I said, theoretical discussion sometimes can be very heavy, can be boring sometimes. So let's take a break from the theoretical discussion. Okay, allow me to share some of my research work with regards to the comparative advantage. Okay, to show to you this is how we apply those theory. Okay, this is how we apply those theory. Okay, this article was written I think it was on July 2020 together with my two other professors. Okay, July 2020 it was when the COVID-19 was still a big issue to many countries, right? So if you can recall, okay, during the early days of COVID-19, we experienced a great shortage, especially in terms of medical products. Okay, if you can recall, we suddenly have shortage in surgical masks. We also have shortage in sanitizers, among others. Okay, now because of this COVID-19 outbreak, okay, when the WHO announced this COVID-19 outbreak, okay, there was an upsurge in demand, particularly for medical product. Either people are panic at that time. Either people buy or bought a medical product for their timely use at that particular time, or they want to keep it as stock. Okay, but we noticed there is upsurge. There was an upsurge in demand. Okay. Apart from that, we also noticed that some countries took this movement control order. Not all countries, but some countries took it. Which disrupts the operations of factories. Okay, and also during that time there were some countries, okay, that take trade measures, okay, such as import restriction at that time. So all of this together has created a great shortage in terms of medical product when COVID happened at that time. So motivated by this, what we want to do is we want to examine, okay, the comparative advantage in producing medical products. So we want to see which countries can produce or have the potential to produce medical product. Okay, initially at the early days of COVID, China dominated the medical product market, and also US, okay, and the USA. Okay, so if these two countries, the major countries, take some actions, okay, something happened to them, it disrupts the supply chains of the medical product. So we believe that it is important for us to look at other potential sources. Okay, so what we did was we examined the comparative advantage. Okay, of course, comparative advantage, we can calculate that, empirically. And of course, in this paper, we just use a simple index, but we did some robustness to this test to verify our finding. So the main finding from this is that there are four groups of medical products. We have medicine, we have medical equipment, we have medical supplies, and also PPP, the personal protective products. Okay, the term used by the WTO is PPP. So of these four products, we noticed that for the production of medicine, that is dominated the middle income countries, for example, Malaysia and China. So by doing this, we are able okay, from the exporter perspective, we know that, okay, we have comparative advantage in producing this particular product, so we need to develop that further. From the importer's perspective, it is important to know, okay, which countries have the comparative advantage, so that if something like this ever happen again in the future, you can, various import sources. Okay, in fact, this is the idea or the strategy, okay, outlined in the WHO document with regards to the preparedness for this kind of disease. Okay, a country need to be able to identify other import sources. Okay, various import sources. All right. So that is just what I would like to share about comparative advantage. And maybe you can see, how do we apply the theory in real world. Okay, I still have few papers, a few works on this, which I'm trying to look at the comparative advantage of Malaysia with regards to producing high technology product. I already have the findings, which should be or will be presented next month, inshallah. I really hope that I can make that finding available in the public domain very soon. Okay, so we understand about the comparative advantage. The next question is, now, what determines this comparative advantage? What determines this country has comparative advantage in this particular goods? And what determines the other countries has comparative advantage in the other types of good? Okay, so back to the theoretical discussion. Okay, to explain this, okay, what determines comparative advantage? Heckscher audience said that we look at the factor endowment. Okay, if a country is blessed, okay, with abundance of capital, then naturally that country, okay, will have comparative advantage in producing capital intensive product. If a country is blessed with abundance of labor, then naturally that particular country will have comparative advantage in producing labor intensive product. Okay, so we have seen at why countries do trade, how countries do trade. Okay, the next part is to look at the implications of trade. To highlight some of the implications of trade, of course, I highlight from the theoretical perspective, but again, try to get the gist of it. Okay, so I choose Samuelson to discuss this because he was among the earliest scholars who talk about, the implication of trade, where he said that if you engage in international trade, that will bring, that will result in factor price equalization. Okay. Or in other words, he said that, okay, simply, if I may put this in a layman words, okay, if you engage in trade, the wage in country A will eventually equal to the wages in country B, eventually, okay? The capital, the price of capital, the interest rate in country A will eventually converge or equal to the capital or to the price of capital in country B. How is that so? Let's look at the analysis. Okay. So bring your attention to the first box, yeah, the one, the capital abundant, this one. I'm not sure whether if I'm showing this, my mouse is, you can see my mouse, okay, but bring your attention to the first box, okay? Now, try to understand this pre-trade situation in the capital abundant countries, okay? So before trade, in the capital abundant countries, price of capital is cheaper because we have a lots of capital. It's abundant, right? So that is easy to get. It's very easy to get the capital. Therefore, the price of that factor is cheaper. What about the price of labor? In the capital abundant countries, okay, labor is relatively scarce. Therefore, the price of labor is higher. Okay, is high as compared to the price of capital in the capital abundant countries, relative term, yeah? Okay, and then later on, when these capital abundant countries engage in trade, okay, after trade, okay, capital abundant countries export capital intensive goods. That means they require more capital inputs, isn't it? Okay, when they require more capital inputs, they demand for capital. When the demand for capital is higher, what happened to the price of capital? When the demand of capital is higher, okay, the price of capital will also increase. Okay, therefore, the price of capital will be higher. What about the price of labor? We have a lot of labor, but we don't demand that in the production of capital intensive good, right? So what happened to the price of labor? The price of labor will be lower. All right. So If you can see my point, my mouse right now, okay, I'm pointing at this price of capital. You look at the orange line, okay, indicating the price of capital in the capital abundant countries, CA. Yeah. So what happened to the price of capital? Initially, it was cheap, but later on, after the trade is going up. Okay. What happened? What about the price of labor? Look at the orange line here, okay, compared of these capital abundant countries. Initially, it was higher, but because of trade, the price of labor is going down. Okay, to understand the convergence of factor price, we need to see also the other box. Okay, the second box. Okay, now put your attention to labor abundant countries, the pre-trade. Okay, the situation of before trade in labor abundant countries. In labor abundant countries, we have a lot of labor. It's abundant. Okay, but we have less capital. For that, the price of capital, because capital is limited in labor abundant countries, right? So the price of capital is high. What about the price of labor? The price of labor is cheaper because it's abundant. You can get that easily, right? Then what happens if we engage in trade? Labor abundant countries export labor intensive goods. Therefore, they will demand for more labor. Okay, as they demand for more labor, okay, what happened to the price of labor? The price of labor will increase because it is in demand. What happened to the price of capital? The price of capital will decrease. So after trade, we will experience a lower capital price in labor abundant countries and also higher labor price in labor abundant countries. So again, bring your attention to the price of capital here, okay, where we have the line, the green line. Okay, in labor abundant countries, the price of capital before trade, it was high, but because of trade, it's going down. Okay, therefore, you can see that, both arrows are going down. Therefore, we say that after engaging in trade, the factor price, the price of capital in both countries is eventually will be the same. Okay, will converge. Similarly goes to the price of labor. Okay, the price of labor is going up in the labor abundant countries, and the price of labor is going down for the capital abundant countries. Therefore, the price of this price of labor in both countries will eventually equalize after trade. Okay, all right. So that is the implication of trade. Okay, among which, okay, we have, of course, we can, trade economists will argue we have other implications of trade. Yes, I acknowledge we have other implications of trade, but at least from, theoretical point of view, this is one of the implication of trade. Okay, and then Stopper and Samuelson, okay, they extend the price equalization theorem or theory, and they try to connect that with income distribution. Okay, I don't intend to explain in detail the theory, but the gist is that international trade will cause abundant factors in a country to get higher returns, while the owner of the scarce resources, okay, will have lower remunerations. All right. Therefore, okay, one of the implications of international trade, okay, if development economists might take up, okay, if to pay attention to the income distribution and issues that may arise from the trading activities, right? All right. So we are done with classical economies. That is, I would say, the most established or the most important components in understanding the flow of trade. But I also acknowledge there are other theories, what we call modern trade theories, trying to explain, trying to observe. They observe the trade flows and also they explain. Of course, I'm not trying to list all, but here are some which I think may be important, right, that I can share with you. All right. Spencer, he said that comparative advantage, okay, can be created. Okay. There was an idea of dynamic comparative advantage. If you see, if you go through literature in detail later on, if you're interested, okay, comparative advantage can be created through government intervention. Okay. If a government say that, okay, I want to develop a comparative advantage in this particular sector, for example, so they must create some sort of policy to support the creation, to support the development of comparative advantage in that particular industry. Okay, and Porter, through his famous Porter's diamond model, he said that a nation competitiveness of a particular countries or just competitiveness in general depends on our ability to innovate constantly. And he also said that national prosperity is created, not inherited. Okay. Portes, of course, he discussed through his diamond model, he gave, all the factors that contribute to the national competitiveness, like factor condition, they have demand condition, they have firm structure, and also some related industry strategies and all. But also, Porter's idea also have some criticism where other scholars come up with double Porter diamond model. So that require a different explanation later. Okay. What about Linde? Linde is among modern trade theories that try to explain why country to trade. He said that country trade based on their similarity. Okay, instead of country trade based on their similarity. Okay, so because based on this hypothesis on an idea, we notice that sometimes developed countries only trade with developed countries because they have same income, they have same taste, they have same level of technology. So the production of good more or less the same, the quality of good more or less the same. Okay, so this is the idea of Linde. I have personally tested this Linde's hypothesis through the study of high technology trade. And yes, we found that in terms of high technology products, developed nation only do trade with developed nations. Okay. That is, if you want to discuss that finding, that will require more times for that. Okay, next, right? Okay, so we some sort of understand. Okay, at least by now, you have we should have achieved our learning outcome. We know why we do trade, we know how we do trade, and also we know the implications of trade, right? Now, we want to talk about this international trade from the Islamic perspective. Okay. I want to bring the discussion to relate or to be, in line with the certificate program. Okay. So whenever we talk about, Islamic perspective, the famous question will be, can or cannot, halal or haram, something like that, right? So when it comes to international trade, we want to know how does Islam view international trade? Okay, as I said in the beginning, it was quite challenging to come up with the material, particularly of this part, but I'll try to do so by taking some of the earliest writing of our Muslim scholars with regard to international trade. Yeah. So one of the earliest writing was made by Shams ad-Din. Okay, allow me to read that. Okay, where he said that the farmer needs the work of the weaver to get clothing for himself, and the weaver needs the work of the farmer to get his food and cotton from which the cloth is made. Therefore, this particular writing suggests that they need to be a division of labor. We need to have specialization. We can't technically produce everything. Okay, we need to specialize, and we need to, we need one another. All right. His writing was supported by another writing made by Ibn Khaldun through in his kitab Al-Muqaddimah, in which he said, allow me to read this again. It is well known and well established that individual human beings are not by themselves capable of satisfying all their economic needs. Okay, they must cooperate for this purpose. The needs that can be satisfied by a group of them through mutual cooperation are many times greater than what individuals are capable of satisfying themselves. Okay, so this these two write-ups, it shows the importance of we need to specialize and we need to cooperate. Okay, indirectly they're saying that, okay, the need for doing trade. Okay, the need for doing trade. Okay, now let's look at some of the objective of external economic policy, or objective that we want to achieve by engaging in international trade from the Islamic perspective. These particular points are taken from the nice write-up by Professor Mohamad Najatullah Siddiqui in 1992. Okay, if I may share some of the objective, why we engage in international trade, or why we interact with other countries. Okay, first is we view the need to preserve and promote economic interests of our own people, with priority attaching to need fulfillment. Okay, sometimes we don't have enough in our country, enough food, for example. Therefore, we need to engage in international trade to to serve or to preserve the interests of our own people. Okay, with regards to need fulfillment. Okay. Second is that, okay, by engaging in international trade, we need to observe the Sharia rules related to economic transactions, okay, with a view to ensuring justice and equity. So yes, we can do, or we are encouraged to do trade, because it's been said, right? We need trade, we need one another. But how do we do that? From Sharia perspective, we need to observe the Sharia law. Okay, that is why it is important, okay, for you to understand the FIG for economies, what you can do, what you can't do, what are the things that can ensure justice, what are the things that can ensure, equity. All right. So that's why the talk or the lecture by Dr. Aslam Akbar on FIG for economies is important, okay, to equip us as an economic agent, as the Caliph of Allah, to understand our duty, okay, to understand our duty in carrying out the international transaction. All right. Okay. And then the third objective is reinforcing cooperation with the Muslim Ummah. Okay. Why we want to do trade? Okay, we want to strengthen the ummah between Muslim nations. We also want to disseminate the values of Islam to others. And also we want to promote human welfare at the global level. That's why, when conducting trade, I say that we need to be equipped with all the Islamic values. As the economic agents, as the Caliph of Allah, okay, we need to equip ourselves with all the Islamic values, that so that whenever we conduct a trade, particularly with non-Muslim countries, we can disseminate the values. We can show this is the Islamic values. Okay, so here are the objectives that we want to achieve through our external economic policy, or objective that we want to achieve when we interact with other countries. Right? So if I may sum that, right? Yes, Islam permits trade or encourage trade, but then Islam obligates our Muslim traders to comply with the Sharia while conducting trade. The next question may come is that how do we ensure that our Muslim traders can comply with the Sharia? It depends. It depends on your individual. That's why I said it's important to equip yourself with the with all the Islamic qualities, inshallah, right? And then what about the motivation to earn profit? The motivation to earn profit is permissible, okay, according to Islam, but then we must make sure that all the economic transactions, as well as the method of dealings, okay, are in accordance to Sharia, right? And also our desire to make profit out of the economic transaction would ultimately benefit not only ourselves, but also the society, and we want to improve public welfare. Okay, so how do we distribute the profit according to Islam? Okay, the question that we had on our previous lectures. Okay, how that must be in a manner of justice or ensure equity, right? Okay, right. Another thing is that the things that I would like to highlight from the Islamic perspective is that any transaction that could create a greater harm, okay, than benefit to the country, community, or the environment are forbidden in Islam. Therefore, as a Muslim, we need to see, okay, we need to evaluate this. We need to evaluate all the transaction, whether it could create greater harm or benefit to our country, right? So that is international trade from Islamic perspective. Okay, so I have, okay, we still have time, a lot of time, inshallah, right? Right. So I think I have, touched on the first part, okay? Now I want to discuss the second part, which is the international trade policy, okay? International trade policy. I told you that we have various policies, but here I just want to discuss a general one with regards to international trade. Okay, so under which I'll talk about free trade. Okay, one of the things that I will talk under international trade policy is the free trade policies. What do we mean by free trade? Okay, it doesn't mean that we can get the goods freely. It doesn't mean that. But when the term free trade means, okay, or refers to a condition when countries can export and import without barriers or without any restrictions. Okay, so if that happens, then we say that we have a free trade. Okay, so the proponents of this idea of this policy, free trade, okay, they highlighted some advantages of if a nation engaged in free trade. Okay, what are the advantages? Okay, I've listed a few here, right? So let's go through it one by one if you have time. All right, so one of which is to attract competition. Okay, if you allow for free trade, means you allow for foreign producers to come into your country, okay, to compete with the domestic producer. Okay, so you by not putting any restriction, you attract competition, you encourage competition. If this happen, then it might reduce the price of the product. Okay, so that is one of the advantages. So who will be at a benefit, or who will receive the advantage of this? Of course, the consumer, right? And then another advantages of the free trade policy is that it creates economies of scale of production. Okay, if we engage in economics, in international trade, okay, rather than just selling our product in our domestic market, we have now access to other markets. Okay, therefore we can produce at large. We can produce more. By producing more, okay, our average total cost will be low, because if you look from a technical perspective, okay, for those who have some economic background, the fixed cost, the average fixed cost will be low. So you by producing more, you will somehow experience an advantage, cost advantage. Okay, cost advantage. Okay, so international trades allows you to experience this cost advantage, right? Thirdly, it can provide greater choice and services. Okay, if we don't have any restriction, okay, that we allow the goods and their services to move freely in our economy, definitely the consumer will have more choices. Okay, more choices of goods and services. Okay, without any restriction or without any additional cost, right? Then by having a free trade, we say that free trade are able to generate higher income, okay, and simultaneously lowers the poverty level. How? Right? So if you allow for free trade, okay, it will somehow stimulate a larger volume of trade. Larger volume of trade, you have a larger economic growth. Okay, this is theoretically, of course. Okay, a larger economic growth, you can you can generate more employment, you can have a higher income, and consequently, it is expected that the poverty level will reduce. Okay, that is one of the highlighted advantage of international trade, right? Next, okay, international trades allow for greater mobility of factors of production. Okay, if we don't have restriction, okay, we allow our factors to move freely. We allow, for example, labor of these countries to work at this country without any permit, for example. We allow the movement of capital, for example. Okay, if we have free trade, okay, we in the real world, we have this agreement called mutual recognition agreement, yeah, which kind of provide standards of guideline or restriction of certain professionals. Okay, let's say a doctor from Indonesia, if she wants to work or he wants to work in Malaysia, he requires certain certificate and all. This kind of thing is a restriction. We put restriction to the mobility of production, but without this, we are encouraging free trade or free mobility or greater mobility of the factors of production. Okay, next is that, okay, free trade can promote innovation. Okay, how does free trade do this? Okay, how can this happen? When we have, we have free trade, we are free to import things, we are free to export things. Okay, that greater flow, not just in terms of volumes, but in terms of variety, product variety, okay, will help to circulate ideas and encourage creativity. All right, so if we have free trade, this is also expected. All right, and then finally, if you have free trade, okay, according to those proponents, they say that a greater trading activities will enhance the rule of law and strengthen the integrity of the administrative system, improve governance. Again, this is from a theoretical point of view. Whether it's true or not, then we need to do another empirical work on this. But yeah, if I may highlight one example regard to this, okay, for a country to export some technology product, they want the importing countries to have a strong intellectual property law, okay, so that their exclusive right will be safe. Okay, so this is an example. If you want, if you have more free trade, okay, somehow you will tend to correct whatever or improve the system that you have in the country. Okay, so talking about all the advantages of free trade, okay, good because of this, good because of that. The next question is that, is it good for all? Okay, so not necessarily. Okay, not necessarily. Some scholars argue that, the gains of trade are not equally distributed. If you recall what we learned from Prof. Gairu last week regarding the trickle-down effect, though it may look good in the, in theory, but, sometimes it doesn't really happen. Okay, it only favors some part of the community, right? Therefore, trade economy says that free trade is good, but trade needs also to be complemented with some well-designed policies, right? Okay, now again, okay, we bring your attention to the Islamic view of free trade. Can or cannot, or halal or haram. I am not sure to say halal or haram. It's a bit heavy because I'm not an Islamic scholar in this context. But let's just try to look at it, whether we can or not, right? So what is Islamic views on this? Islamic supports free trade and also natural competition. Throughout our lectures or our classes, okay, in the previous week, you may have come across this story for quite, a number of times I observed, okay? So at that time, Prophet Muhammad SAW encouraged competition, and also he wants the market forces to work freely without any interference. That is the ideal condition. However, okay, in circumstances where trade brings harms to society, then it becomes imperative for the government to take action. Okay? All right. So that is about free trade. Now, under the same topic of international trade policy, let us talk about trade protectionism. Okay? What do we mean by trade protectionism? It is the economic policy adopted by the government. Okay, why they adopt this? To protect, okay, as the name suggests, protectionism, to protect the domestic industries, okay, from foreign competition. How do they protect? Okay, they put up some barriers to trade. Okay, we call that barriers to trade. So here I have listed some argument of why country engage in or country decide to protect. Yeah, some arguments. So the first one is the famous argument in any text, in any discussion, in any report. That is the famous argument, right? Infant industry. Okay, why do country want to protect? Why you impose certain restriction to protect your domestic? Because this is infant industry. We argue that we have infant industry. We want to let it grow. We want to let it mature. So we want to protect them from any competition, foreign competition. Okay, that's why we impose certain restriction. Okay, one classic example, okay, with regards to the infant industry argument, at least in the context of Malaysia, is the national car. Okay, we have our national car industry. Okay, so we want to protect this because previously it was known as infant because it is relatively new. So what the government does was government imposed import tariff on foreign car so that it is more attractive for consumer to buy our own national car. Okay. Now this the tax that they impose or the tariff they impose on imported car is known as a protectionist policy, or protectionist measure, one of it. But maybe, you know, some of you might argue, but how long, you know, how infant is infant? How long does it take for an industry to be infant industry? The question is depends. The answer is depends on the judgment, right? If the government want to say this is infant industry, then up till after 50 years or so, then it's still different industry. Of course, it creates argument, but you know, that was worth of a debate, right? Another form of protectionism. Okay, another argument why countries protect is to protect domestic industry from anti-dumping. Okay, so sometimes, you know, when a country, okay, a country can produce more, they have access. Okay, like now let's say a country can sell with international trade, instead of just selling domestically, now they have access to other countries, other markets. So they produce more, they produce much at a large scale. Okay, and then if they have access, okay, of this, okay, they have access than what is needed than the domestic industry, they go and dump all the products, all the excess product in another country. Okay, dump meaning it can be seen as some sort of international sales, right? They can sell this at a lower price, okay, which may hurt the domestic producer. Now, because of this, okay, to protect domestic producer from further injury, what the government can do is they can impose anti-dumping duty, so that the price of the foreign product is equivalent to what the domestic producer can offer, right? And then another argument is that, okay, why we protect? Because we want to support the buy local product campaign. Okay, so we impose certain restriction on imported products so that it will become expensive, and the demand of the consumer is directed towards the local product, right? Okay. Another reason why we protect is it is a form of government resource. Whenever government put a tariff, okay, that is the government revenue for that tariff imposed is a form of government revenue. So that's why they impose this protection, this kind of protectionist policy. Okay. Another reason would be in terms of the security reason. Sometimes countries may impose restriction because they have, let's say health reason. Okay, for example, some countries prohibit the import of weapon, for example. This is for security reason. Okay, that's why they don't want me to have a free trade, in this context. So they impose certain restriction, right? And finally, okay, why countries choose to protect? Sometimes they want to improve their balance of payments. Okay, in the case where they need to reduce import and increase export, so sometimes they put restriction. Okay, I have some example on of trade protectionism. I think we still have around 10 minutes, inshallah. Okay, some example. Okay, I know that this is, quite old. Okay, but just to highlight the example, remember a few years back when there was a trade war between US and China, and then they began to impose tariff on one another. Okay, this is a form of trade barriers, okay, in the form of tariffs. Okay. Another example is that this is even, longer. This article was in 2012, but I remember the measures taken was in 2011, where our export, Malaysia's export of bird nest, experienced an import ban. Okay. This is another form of restriction. As you can see there, the reason why they impose the ban is because due to the nitrite contamination. Of course, this is pertaining to health issues. So this is another example of trade barriers. It can be in the form of tariffs. It can be in the forms of other restriction. Okay. So types of tariff, maybe I'll go through this very quickly. Okay, as you can see from my example just now, we can have tariffs, the trade barriers. Okay, it can be in terms of tariff, it can be in terms of non-tariff. Okay, so as for tariff, it can be imposed on import. It can be either in the form of import tariff. It can be imposed on import. It can be imposed on export. Depends. And in terms of the tariff rates, yeah, if you want to understand the tariff rates itself, okay, we have several types of rate. Okay, like applied tariff rate is the actual tariff applied when you trade the product. Okay, how many percent that you need to pay? That is what we call an applied tariff. Okay, while MFN bound rate is the MFN is actually most favored nation. That is the rate agreed or bound at the multilateral trading platform or system, okay, where many countries, okay, come together and then we agree, okay, this is the rate that we are going to apply. This is the bound rate for this particular product, okay. So it can act as, or it can serve as the ceiling tariff, okay, rate, the ceiling tariff rate. So normally between the applied tariff and also the bound tariff, there will be some room, okay? So it's normal to see the applied tariff is much lower than the bound rate because we want to allow for some flexibility to for the countries, yeah? For the countries. And then we also have preferential tariff rate where we only give certain like tariff rate to certain countries that, you know, maybe we engage in preferential trade agreement, you know, we say that, okay, for this particular group, this is the tariff rate. Okay, I hope I can make that, you know, as simply, I can simplify that as much as possible. Okay, now, tariff barriers can also be in the form of trade barriers can be in the form of non-tariff, okay, where you impose the import quota. What do we mean by quota? We just say, okay, for this particular product, okay, for example, for cabbage, we only allow for example, only 60,000 kgs can come into Malaysia. Why we impose this? Because we want to give some, you know, some opportunities for domestic producer to also compete in the market. So we impose some quota, all right? And then we also have tariff rate quota, okay, in which, okay, we have quota, say for example, just now, okay, we allow only 60,000 kgs of cabbage to come into Malaysia. If, you know, you want to export or you want to import more into Malaysia or you want to export more into Malaysia, you know, the excess need to, you know, subject to certain tariff level, right? So that is what do you mean by tariff rate quota. Another example is that voluntary export restraint, where the exporting countries voluntarily, say that they want to limit their export. Okay, I have an example of this. Okay, and in fact, you know, as much as we see the COVID-19 as a challenges, we can also take it as, you know, a tool for us to study. When I studied this, when I first studied about this, you know, voluntary export restraint, I cannot really understand. I cannot really understand because I think, you know, which country wants to limit import? Why limit export? Why do we want to limit export? I can't really see it at that time, much year later, before, yeah, more than 10 years before, right? At that time, I just, you know, see this as something, okay, I can't see why countries want to limit their export. But then when COVID happened, okay, this restriction or these measures are clearly, I can see this very clearly, when countries impose certain restriction on their export, they don't want to export, say, their medical products. Some countries even send notification to the WTO, say that they don't want to export their food products with the argument that they want to take care of the domestic needs. Okay, so as I said, sometimes, you know, as much as we want to see COVID-19 is a challenge or a test for us, it is also a tool for us to learn, all right? Also hikmah for some, right? All right. Another types of barriers could be in terms of the subsidies, okay? If government give subsidies to directly, to increase export for the domestic producer, to increase export, then it will cause the cost of production for domestic producer to reduce. Therefore, domestic producer can offer lower rate, okay, in the international market. So this is indirectly, you know, it doesn't contribute to the healthy competition. Okay, therefore, sometimes subsidies is also known or also seen as a trade barriers. Okay, particularly with subsidies directly directly related to export, right? Then finally, another form of trade barriers is standards. Okay, sometimes we put a certain measures. Okay, if you want to, let's say, if you want to export this, you must have this certificate, this clean certificate, sanitary and phytosanitary certificate. Okay, this kind of standard is another form of non-trade barriers. As you can see from this example, okay, you can see down here, okay, if Malaysia want to export our bird nest, okay, we need to obtain 3 quality certifications, right? So this is a form of restriction, okay, standards restriction. Okay. So while going through, I wanted to find some example of voluntary export restraint. Actually, I wanted to find something related to COVID, but then when I searched through, this is the latest one, okay, which was just introduced 2 or 3 days ago. Okay, this is the sample of notification, okay, sent by a country, okay, sent by a country. If let's say this one was sent by European Union on behalf of Hungary, okay, they want to take this voluntary export restraint measure, okay, in which they want to take this measure, temporary export control measure on these items, cereals, yeah. Of course, they provide some justification here. They need to provide some justification. In this regard is the war between Ukraine and Russia that may impact, may harm the domestic needs. That's why they, they opted for this kind of restraint. You can go through many examples. Actually, you can go through the WTO website and look at the, I think, links, lots of list of documentation. You can find the notification there. Various many countries and their notification with very strict measures. Okay, this is just one of the examples to show to you. Okay, this is how countries conduct this. All right. Now again, whether we can protect, okay, from the Islamic perspective, okay. So trade restrictions are allowed according to Muslim scholars, but then any policy action requires a strong justification and also a careful consideration. We must take into consideration all aspects, okay, before we implement a certain policy action. Okay, in fact, import duties were imposed during Caliph Umar administration during Sahabah's time, okay, in response to complaints made by traders that duties are being imposed on them at the entry point of the foreign markets. That shows that, Islam permits this kind of protection, okay. But then any policy action that we want to take, the priority must be the maslahah or the public interest, right? Okay, let me go through very quickly on the economic integration, because this will cover the cooperation part. Okay, so as you know, trade agreement. Okay, what do you mean by trade agreement? When certain countries, okay, some countries, they come together, 2 or more nations, they come together, they make some agreement, sign some agreement to say, okay, let's reduce the barriers for trade. Okay, let's reduce the barriers for import and export. That is what we call a trade agreement. Okay, so under this trade agreement, it just means that the goods and services, okay, can be bought and sold across border with little or no government intervention. All right, so here are the stages of economic integration. Maybe I can skip this, okay. Just you need to know that there are stages of integration, yeah. Stages of agreement. I'll leave it to you to read this later. All right, and then we can have classification of trade agreements. Okay, this is maybe more relevant to for you to understand, for a layman to understand. Sometimes when we read newspapers, when we read the articles, with regard to international trade, we come across a lot of multilateral, bilateral, regional. Okay, so let's try to understand what is that. Okay, so the trade agreement, okay, the historical approach will be, it was the multilateral approach, where all countries, okay, after the World War II, we signed GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, okay, in 1947, okay, with the aim to have a liberal multilateral trading system. Okay, we want to last time, after the World War II, the tariff was really high. So all the countries come together and say, look, we need to reduce this. Okay, we need to reduce this. Therefore, they created this, they signed this agreement, and they created what we call as, last time, what we call that as ITO, International Trade Organization. But after that, we rename it to World Trade Organization. But then after several rounds of negotiation, it seems very hard to reach consensus. Okay, so we can say that WTO negotiation were in a deadlock. Therefore, countries that have a strong interest to liberalize their trade, they are shifting from the multilateral approach, okay, to a bilateral approach or even regional approach. All right. So this is what we mean by a regional. If you see a regional agreement, okay, this is the preferential trading arrangement between countries that have a geographical proximity in a particular region. For example, we have AFTA. AFTA was signed among among ASEAN countries. Yeah, and then we can also have bilateral, where a country sign a trade agreement with another country. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm using the Malaysian experience here. Okay, so these are the list of bilateral FTAs signed by Malaysia, and also we can see some of the regional FTAs signed by Malaysia. I've put some source there. This is from our MITI's official website. You can go and visit that later if you want more information, right? Okay, these are the things also I would like to skip. Okay, issues in trade agreements. All right. Maybe you can you can read this on your own, or if you have questions or you need further clarification from this, you can always email me on that, right? Okay, we want to look at the cooperation among Muslim countries. We know that we have this organization of Islamic cooperation, OIC, established in 1969 with the aim to enhance cooperation among and promote intra-OIC trade through preferential trade agreement of the Muslim countries. All right, so that is the aim. Okay, this is what we have recently. This is from the recent economic outlook produced by SESTRIC. SESTRIC is the organization that taking care of this kind of the economic development of OIC, right? So we can see that the share of intra-OIC trade, okay, if you talk about the intra-OIC trade in terms of volume, it's reducing from the previous year, okay, from 2019 to 2020, particularly because of the pandemic. But then if you look at in terms of the share of intra-OIC trade, we can see that it is increasing, okay, to 19.5% in 2020, which is the highest level. However, actually OIC countries have this 10-year action program, okay, in which we want to try to achieve 25% of share of intra-OIC trade of the total trade, okay. But looking at the very slow increase of the share, some scholars raise a concern about whether we are able to achieve that by 2025, right? Okay, so here just to share some of the major exporter and importer who export intra-OIC export and intra-OIC imports. Okay, I will leave that to you. You can go back and look at this further. If you want to look at the cooperation in the Muslim countries, okay, we have the 8 cooperations. Okay, the idea of cooperation among Muslim countries was mooted by this Professor Dr. Necmettin Erbakan. He was the Prime Minister of Turkey before. Okay, so the members of the 8 was Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Malaysia, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Turkey. The objective is again to improve member state position in the global economy and diversify and create opportunities in trade relations. We want to enhance participation in decision-making at the international level and also improve standard of living. This is just one example. Okay, we have other cooperation also, but I just include a few in this presentation. Okay, trend in the global trade. Okay, if you can see trend in the global trade, yesterday I have a time to quickly, look at this information. So this was really fresh from the database. Okay, if you can see in terms of merchandise export, the blue table is the main or top 5 exporter of the merchandise export. Okay, if you want to look in terms of the Muslim countries, the top 5 export of the Muslim countries is there listed in the table, green table. Okay, So these are the main players. Okay, these are the main players in the merchandise export. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Intan, for notifying me. I understand. Maybe I can have another 2 minutes just to conclude, yeah, if that's possible. So this is just to highlight on the emergence of peripheral players. Okay, we know that China has been really received attention in the context of international trade. So this is their share, the trade, the trend of their share in terms of merchandise export. You can see that their share is really increasing. Okay. Okay, so maybe I can skip this also. This is just a sharing for my work. And this is the halal trade overview. We can see that, I don't have data on export, but in terms of halal imports and growth, we can see that it shrank a bit as compared to 2019, but it is forecast that imports or Muslim will spend more on halal product. By 2025, we predict an increase of 3.8% over the year. Okay, who are the top exporter to OIC, or in other words, from who we are buying our products? Okay, so we can see here who are the top exporter to OIC. Okay, we also can see who are the top importers for the OIC countries. Right? Okay, so the way forward here is not really, a way forward of what I want to suggest for international trade. It's just some from our lecture, maybe some homework for us to think. Okay, maybe we should explore in strengthening the intra-OIC trade. Maybe we should explore, in terms of introducing e-commerce platform, make use of whatever we have, right? And then maybe we need to think of some, developing comparative advantage, especially in critical industry, okay, that supports the needs or the needs of the Muslim countries and all right? And then we also, we talk about all this, trade here and there, trade of goods and services. And then we also need to think of the sector that to support this trade, to support these activities. Therefore, maybe we can look more, maybe we can look further in terms of Sharia compliance, trade financing. Another interesting topic to be discussed. Okay, so I don't want to leave you, empty-handed. Okay, so I give you some review question. This is for your homework. You don't have to send to me, but this is for your reflection. Okay, with that, thank you so much. Sorry I took 6 minutes longer with something that I skipped. If you have question, okay, you can always email me later. All right, Dr. Intan, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.